Specker's Paradox. Imagine a world where the act of assigning truth to a simple question becomes impossible, not because the question is absurd, but because the world itself resists resolution. This is the strange territory into which Specker's Paradox leads us, a quiet but powerful conundrum that doesn't shout with complexity, but hums softly with implication. It was introduced by Ernst Specker in the realm of logic and quantum mechanics, a subtle puzzle that challenges our very idea of decision, determinacy, and truth. At first glance, it feels like a gentle riddle, something you could solve in a few moments. But as you follow it deeper, the walls begin to dissolve, and you're left with something far more elusive. A world where some truths can never be chosen without contradiction. To understand the roots of Specker's paradox, we first step into the framework of logical decision theory, the study of how agents, human or artificial, make rational choices. Specker was interested in the formal underpinnings of such decisions, especially in systems where truth values are assigned to statements in a way that's internally consistent. But the twist comes when you're asked to pre-assign truth values to a group of statements, where each statement on its own seems perfectly reasonable, and yet, when taken together, they resist all consistent assignments. It's not that the statements are wrong or self-contradictory individually. The paradox emerges only when you're forced to decide among them as a group, especially when those decisions influence each other. It's a paradox not of error, but of context. Let's bring the abstraction closer to home. Imagine you're given a box containing 3 cards, each with a number printed on one side and either a red or blue dot on the other. You're told that you can pick any 2 cards to turn over, and for each possible pair, a rule holds. If both cards are red, then their numbers add to an even value. This seems innocent enough. You test several pairs and confirm the rule, but then you're asked to predict the number on the 3rd card without turning it over, and maintain consistency with what you've observed. Suddenly, you're trapped. Every time you try to apply the rule to a new pair, it interferes with the assumption you made about the previous ones. The moment you commit to a value, you unravel the harmony you were trying to preserve. This captures the essence of Specker's paradox. The conflict doesn't arise from the parts, but from the attempt to see the whole. The paradox gains its true weight when applied to quantum mechanics, where it intersects with the Kokin-Specker theorem, an extension of Specker's original ideas into the quantum world. The theorem demonstrates that it is impossible to assign definite truth values, like yes or no, true or false, to all properties of a quantum system in a way that respects the rules of quantum measurement. In other words, the outcome of a quantum measurement doesn't just depend on the property being measured, it depends on what other measurements are being considered alongside it. Reality, under this lens, refuses to reveal itself in a global, objective fashion. You can't lay out all the properties of a system and assign them truth values ahead of time. You can only know them in the moment, in the context of measurement, and once the context shifts, so does the fabric of truth. This is not just an oddity of mathematics or physics. It speaks to the very nature of knowledge and the limits of understanding. Specker's paradox tells us that in certain systems, whether logical, physical, or informational, trying to be omniscient leads to contradiction. You cannot predict the outcome of every question in advance without eventually running into a wall. This pushes against the classical notion of determinism, where every future state is locked in by the present. In the world of Specker, that assumption falters. It suggests a universe where truth is local, not global, contextual, not absolute. Even in the realm of artificial intelligence and computation, Specker's paradox casts its shadow. Suppose you're designing an AI that must evaluate a collection of interrelated facts and make decisions accordingly. If these facts are entangled in a way that mimics Specker's structure, the AI may be forced into paradox, no matter how intelligent it is. This isn't a failure of the machine, It's a reflection of the structure of the information. The rules are set up in such a way that complete consistency is forbidden. This realization has deep implications for how we model knowledge and build systems to understand the world. It hints that even the most perfect mind may stumble when the logic beneath the surface is rigged to resist harmony. Consider for a moment how this might feel as a human experience. You're presented with three truths, each believable, each supported by evidence, and yet when you try to believe all three at once, your mind rebels. It's like trying to build a triangle out of straight lines where the angles don't meet. The paradox isn't in your reasoning, it's in the structure you're trying to impose it on. This experience isn't limited to logic puzzles. We encounter versions of it in ethics, decision-making, and even in social dynamics. Three friends, each trustworthy, each with a different story, each claiming something that can't all be true together. The paradox bleeds into life. The subtle horror of Specker's paradox is that it doesn't reveal itself immediately. It waits. It lets you think you're making progress, resolving questions one at a time, only to pull the rug out from under you when you try to see the whole. This is what makes it so potent in quantum logic. In classical logic, contradictions are sharp and immediate. You spot them quickly. But in Specker's world, contradiction is postponed until the very end. It only emerges when you try to finalize the picture. Until then, you are lulled into a false sense of coherence. This delay is psychological. It lets you believe in the dream of total understanding just long enough to make the collapse more disorienting. There's a quiet beauty in this paradox, one that lies in its gentleness. Unlike more famous paradoxes that shout their mystery, the liar, the barber, the grandfather, Specker's whispers. It waits in systems that seem harmless. It appears in colors, in cards, in numbers. It hides in measurements, in assignments, in beliefs. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. It becomes a lens through which you view every system of knowledge. You start to wonder, where else are we forcing coherence onto something that was never meant to be coherent? Where else are we believing that if we just knew a little more, we could tie the whole thing together? Specker's paradox warns, maybe you can't. Maybe the universe is wired so that full understanding is structurally out of reach. Even more chilling is the implication that truth under certain conditions is not just unknown, it is unknowable. There are systems where assigning truth values isn't just difficult, it's logically forbidden. No amount of insight, no computational power, no quantum trickery can resolve the contradictions that arise. The map cannot fit the territory. Not because the map is flawed, but because the territory twists and bends in ways that defy global coherence. Truth in such systems is like a quantum particle. Every time you pin it down, it slips into another configuration. The act of choosing alters what can be known. This speaks to a broader philosophical theme, the limits of objectivity. Specker's paradox tells us that perhaps objectivity, as we've traditionally conceived it, is a myth in certain domains. There may be no grand cosmic truth table with every fact marked T or F. Instead, there may only be snapshots, partial views, moments of clarity that collapse when viewed together. It's a humbling thought. It moves us away from the fantasy of total knowledge and toward a new kind of wisdom, one that accepts the contextual, the incomplete, the unresolved. And yet, far from being paralyzing, Specker's paradox can also be liberating. It gives us permission to stop seeking impossible certainties. It tells us that some questions are unanswerable, not because we're ignorant, but because the structure of the universe forbids it. This doesn't mean we should stop asking. On the contrary, it means we must change the way we ask. We must become attuned to context, aware of dependency, sensitive to the hidden web of implications behind every choice. To live with Specker's paradox is to live in a world where not every truth can be known at once, and that's okay. So, if you ever find yourself holding three ideas that each feel solid on their own but fall apart together, remember Specker. Remember the cards, the rules, the measurements that change depending on what else you measure. Remember that the conflict may not be in your reasoning, but in the deeper structure you're trying to uncover. Let the paradox speak, not of failure, but of depth. Let it remind you that some truths shimmer only at the edges of certainty, vanishing when you try to grasp them all at once. And in that shimmering, in that flicker of almost acknowledge, maybe there is something truer still. Jourdain's card paradox. Imagine holding a card in your hand, a simple rectangle of paper with a sentence written on each side. There's no puzzle, no numbers, no hidden code, just two plain statements, one on the front and one on the back. It's the kind of thing a child might play with, or a teacher might use to test reading comprehension. But as you begin to read, you find yourself caught in a loop. The words are clear, but the meaning coils back on itself. One side of the card tells you the sentence on the other side is true. You flip the card, and the other side says the sentence on the first side is false. Back and forth you go, reading truth into falsehood and falsehood into truth, until you realize the card is not a card at all. It is a trap for the mind. This is the essence of Jourdain's card paradox, a logical puzzle first proposed by the English logician Philippe Jourdain in the early 20th century. At first glance, it seems harmless. No intricate math, no quantum mechanics, just two sentences and a card. But what it hides is a devastating self-referential loop, a paradox that exposes the instability at the heart of certain types of logical systems. The card does not scream for attention like the famous liar paradox, but it hums with quiet contradiction, offering no exit once you've entered its loop of reasoning. Let's describe the card more clearly. On one side it reads, "The sentence on the other side of this card is true." Flip the card, and the other side reads, "The sentence on the other side of this card is false." That's it. No tricks, no ambiguity, and yet, the moment you try to evaluate either sentence, you find yourself spinning. Suppose you assume the first sentence is true, but that sentence says the first is false. So the first cannot be true. Contradiction. Now suppose you assume the first sentence is false. Then the second sentence must be false, but that sentence claims the first is false. So a false sentence is claiming something false, meaning the first sentence must be true. Contradiction again. You are stuck in a paradoxical dance, every step negating the last. This paradox may seem like a linguistic game, a clever trick with words, but its implications are deeper than mere wordplay. Jourdain's card paradox is a cousin of the liar paradox, that ancient riddle where a man says, "I am lying." If he's telling the truth, then he's lying, and if he's lying, then he's telling the truth. But Jourdain's twist introduces an externalized form. Rather than a sentence referring to itself directly, each sentence refers to the other, creating a loop of reference that at first seems to escape the self-consciousness problem, but doesn't. It reintroduces the same instability in a more subtle form, one that mirrors how we often construct arguments, beliefs, and even entire systems of thought. This kind of logical entanglement plays a central role in the study of formal systems and semantics. It reveals how even a simple pair of statements can collapse under the weight of mutual dependency. In our daily lives, we take it for granted that statements can be true or false, that claims can be verified or disproven. But what happens when a statement's truth depends entirely on the truth of another statement, which in turn depends on the first? The idea of a fixed truth value evaporates. You're left in a space where logic can no longer anchor itself. Jourdain's card is a doorway to that unsettling terrain. There's something poetic about how this paradox reveals itself. You don't need complex training or advanced mathematics to fall into it. Anyone can hold the card, read it, and experience the confusion. It democratizes paradox, inviting anyone, child or scholar, to glimpse the fragility of reason. And yet, despite its simplicity, Jourdain's card paradox touches the edges of Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Tarski's undefinability of truth. It whispers of limits, of the boundaries of knowledge, and of the impossibility of creating a complete, consistent logical system that accounts for its own truth. In fact, what makes this paradox truly remarkable is not just its circular structure, but the way it reflects the human desire for closure. We read a sentence and want to know, is it true or false? We want resolution, a clear box to place each statement in. But Jourdain's card denies us that. It reminds us that some statements, when constructed in certain ways, resist classification. They inhabit a liminal space, neither wholly true nor wholly false, but suspended in a kind of logical twilight. That suspension is unsettling and yet strangely beautiful, because it tells us that, even in a world ruled by reason, mystery remains. This paradox also raises deeper philosophical questions about the nature of reference and language. When a sentence points to another sentence, and that one points back, what is actually being communicated? Is there an underlying truth, or is the meaning only an illusion created by the act of reference itself? Jourdain's card paradox doesn't answer these questions, it embodies them. It is a living demonstration of language's power to both reveal and obscure, to clarify and to confound. It shows us that sometimes meaning collapses not because the words are flawed, but because the structure they form loops in on itself endlessly. Consider, too, how this paradox might manifest in human communication. We often rely on second-hand information, on sources that refer to other sources, on beliefs that reinforce each other in circles. Two people might each believe something because the other believes it. A community might hold a doctrine whose truth rests solely on mutual affirmation. The Jourdain paradox, in its quiet way, warns us of the dangers of such self-reinforcing loops. It tells us that truth, grounded only in reference, can become untethered from reality. That certainty born of mutual assurance can still collapse under scrutiny. In a more abstract sense, Jourdain's card paradox reflects the instability at the heart of any system that tries to represent itself. Whether it's a logical framework, a computer program, or even a mind trying to understand itself, the act of self-representation introduces tension. This is why certain foundational attempts in mathematics and logic, such as Russell's paradox and Gödel's theorems, reveal limits not through complexity, but through the system turns inward, tries to wrap itself in its own logic, and tears at the seams. Jourdain's card is a miniature version of that unraveling, a pocket-sized model of deeper philosophical collapse. And yet, there is something strangely comforting about this paradox. It reminds us that confusion isn't always the enemy. Sometimes confusion is the sign that we've reached the edge of a system's explanatory power, that we've touched the boundary between what can be known and what must be accepted as undefined. In this way, Jourdain's card paradox doesn't just confound, it enlightens. It shows us where language breaks, where logic wobbles, where certainty fades. And in doing so, it invites us to be gentler with the world and with ourselves in the face of ambiguity. You might be wondering, is there a way out? Can we rewrite the card, rephrase the statements, restructure the logic to escape the loop? Some have tried. They've proposed changing the language, introducing multi-valued logic, or stepping outside the binary of true and false. In some logical systems, like paraconsistent logic or non-classical semantics, contradictions can be tolerated, managed, even explored. These systems provide a kind of asylum for paradoxes like Jourdain's, where the contradiction is not a fatal flaw but a feature to be studied. But even in these frameworks, the essential mystery remains. The paradox cannot be resolved, it can only be recontextualized. So what does the card ultimately teach us? It teaches humility. It teaches caution. It teaches that not all questions have answers, and not all sentences can be pinned to a single truth. In a world that prizes clarity, the Jourdain card paradox is a quiet reminder that some of the most profound insights come not from resolution, but from the graceful acceptance of irresolution. And in that acceptance there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of knowing which answers are forever out of reach. Let the cards sit in your mind like a gentle echo. Not a scream, not a warning, but a whisper. A folded message, passed from one hand to another, carrying within it the soft hum of contradiction. Hold it gently, read it slowly, and as you flip it back and forth, remember that some truths live not in certainty, but in the spaces between. Richard's Paradox. Imagine a dictionary sitting on a quiet shelf, filled with all the definitions of all the English words ever written. It seems like a simple book, one we trust to tell us what things mean, how to speak, how to understand. But what if, in trying to define everything, the dictionary accidentally defines something that cannot exist? What if the very act of cataloging language opened a doorway into paradox, a contradiction that wasn't caused by poor grammar or faulty thinking, but by the structure of language itself? This is the heart of Richard's Paradox, a quietly unsettling discovery that shows how even the most careful use of language can lead us into impossible territory. The paradox was introduced by Jules Richard, a French mathematician, in the early 20th century. His goal wasn't to cause confusion or invent a philosophical riddle. He was working on a very precise idea: the nature of definability. In mathematics, some numbers can be described using language, simple sentences, formulas, or patterns. These are called definable numbers. Others, by contrast, are so complex that no amount of linguistic description can ever truly capture them. They exist mathematically, but cannot be named or pinned down by any finite sentence. Richard was fascinated by this boundary between what can be named and what cannot, and in trying to draw that boundary, he accidentally stepped over it. To understand the paradox, we begin with an assumption. Imagine all the possible English sentences that define real numbers between 0 and 1. Some are very short. For example, the number 0.5 is an obvious one. Others are more complex, like the square root of 2 divided by 3. Now imagine listing all of these definitions in a huge catalog, an infinite list of all the numbers that can be described using a finite number of English words. For each definition, we can look at the decimal expansion of the number it defines, its digits going on and on after the decimal point. And now comes Richard's subtle move. Using this list, we construct a brand new number. This number will be different from every number in the list, because we deliberately change the nth digit of the nth number's decimal expansion. If the digit is a 3, we change it to a 4. If it's a 7, we change it to a 1. We go down the list, one entry at a time, modifying each digit to ensure the new number differs from the nth number at the nth place. This idea is very similar to Cantor's diagonal argument, used to prove that some infinities are bigger than others. But Richard wasn't trying to compare sizes of infinities. He was trying to stay within the realm of definable numbers. And here's the twist. The new number we created, different from every number in the list, is itself defined by the list. It's defined by the process we just used, the number whose nth digit differs from the nth digit of the nth definable number. That's a description, a sentence in English, which means that this new number should be part of the list. But we specifically built it to not be on the list. It contradicts itself. If it is in the list, it cannot be in the list. If it's not in the list, then our list of all definable numbers is incomplete. We are trapped. What makes this paradox so haunting is that everything seems to be done carefully. There's no trickery, no ambiguous phrasing. We began with a list of numbers defined in clear English. We followed a precise method to construct a new number. and yet the very act of defining this number pushes it outside the scope of our original list, even though the construction itself was based entirely on definition. It's a quiet contradiction, one that emerges not from sloppy reasoning, but from reasoning done too well. Richard's paradox raises deep questions about language, logic, and the nature of definitions. What does it mean for something to be definable? How many numbers can truly be described in finite terms? And most disturbingly, can we even trust language to fully capture mathematical reality? The paradox shows that there are limits, not just to what we can know, but to what we can say. It reveals that the boundary between describable and indescribable is itself slippery. The moment we try to define the undefinable, we create a contradiction. In trying to name the unnameable, we break the system we hoped would contain it. The implications extend far beyond mathematics. Richard's paradox is a close cousin of the liar paradox and Gödel's incompleteness theorems. In all these cases, we find systems of language, of logic, of arithmetic that seem self-consistent until they are asked to talk about themselves. The moment they try to contain their own rules, they fracture. The system turns inward and paradox emerges. Richard's paradox reminds us that self-representation is both powerful and dangerous. When language points back at itself, when definition becomes entangled with its own process, cracks begin to appear. Truth, consistency, and even meaning become unstable. It's worth pausing to reflect on how often we encounter this instability in everyday life. We rely on language to define, to classify, to bring order. Dictionaries, laws, and rules are all built on the assumption that things can be described, pinned down, made unambiguous. But language is a living thing. It bends, it loops, it reflects itself. Definitions often rely on other definitions. Sentences refer to other sentences. Systems depend on other systems to define their terms. This recursive nature, though useful, creates space for paradox. Richard's discovery was not just about numbers, it was about the limits of what any system of meaning can hold. There's a strange beauty in the paradox. It takes something simple, a list, a sentence, a number, and finds the hidden fracture inside it. It invites us to marvel at the complexity buried beneath the surface of even the most ordinary things. And it teaches us that the search for total understanding may always leave something out. There will always be a number that slips through the cracks, a truth that can't be named, a meaning that defies capture. Richard's paradox is not a failure of logic. It is a window into its edge. This paradox also opens the door to questions about computation and artificial intelligence. In a world where machines are trained to understand and generate language, how do we ensure they avoid these loops of contradiction? If a machine is trained to define things using natural language, could it stumble into Richard's trap? Could it produce a definition that both exists and doesn't exist within its own set of knowledge? The paradox suggests that any system based on rules and descriptions, even a machine, may carry within it the seeds of its own confusion. As we build increasingly complex models of language and knowledge, Richard's insight becomes more important, not less. For philosophers, the paradox touches on the limits of epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. How do we know what we know? Can something be true if it can't be expressed? Can something be expressed if its expression invalidates it? These are not just abstract questions. They echo through our decisions, our beliefs, our systems of education and governance. Richard's paradox gently reveals that not all knowledge can be boxed, labeled, and filed away. Some truths hover just beyond the reach of language, visible only in the contradictions they leave behind. And in the silence between sentences, there is something humbling. Richard's paradox doesn't shout its contradiction, it whispers it. You only notice the loop after careful reflection. It doesn't demand resolution, it offers a mirror. In that mirror, we see not just a flaw in logic, but a reflection of ourselves. Our desire to understand everything, to name every truth, to draw perfect boundaries around meaning. This desire is noble, but Richard's paradox tells us it is also impossible. The map will always miss something. The words will always fall short. The list will always leave one number behind. So where does this leave us? Do we abandon definition, truth, and logic? No. But we approach them with a new kind of humility. We recognize that systems, linguistic, mathematical, or philosophical, are not perfect containers. They are tools, and every tool has its limits. Richard's paradox is a reminder to be careful when defining the world, and to leave space for what cannot be defined. It teaches us that some of the most profound mysteries are not hidden in complexity, but exposed by the very clarity we chase. As you let this paradox settle in your mind, imagine again that giant list of definitions, stretching endlessly across time and space. Each one a sentence, a thought, an attempt to pin down reality. Somewhere among them, hidden in the folds of logic, is the number that cannot be named, yet was named in the process of escaping. It is not just a number, it is a whisper, a flicker, a reminder that some things can be created only by not being created, defined only by not being definable. And that, in the quiet tension between expression and impossibility, we catch a glimpse of something deeper than truth. Curry's paradox. There's a peculiar kind of silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from encountering something that simply shouldn't be. Something so logically smooth, so deceptively simple, that the mind stumbles before realizing it's already slipped into a trap. Curry's paradox is one of those quiet impossibilities. It doesn't scream, it doesn't dazzle with technical complexity. Instead, it gently unfolds a contradiction using nothing more than ordinary logic and language, just enough to show you that reason itself, when left unchecked, can fold in on itself and produce the unbelievable. At the heart of this paradox is a sentence seemingly benign that proves anything you want, anything at all, without using lies or tricks, just by existing in the right structure. Curry's paradox is named after Haskell Curry, a logician and mathematician who explored the foundations of implication and truth in logic. The paradox emerges not from the content of a particular statement, but from the form that the statement takes. And like many of the most unsettling paradoxes, it stems from self-acceptance. Imagine a sentence that says, "If this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists." It seems like a joke at first, a linguistic sleight of hand. But if we take the statement seriously, if we treat it with the same rules of implication that govern formal logic, it begins to warp the fabric of consistency. And it doesn't stop with Santa Claus. Once the structure is in place, the paradox can be used to prove absolutely anything. Let's break it down. Suppose the sentence, "If this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists," is indeed true. According to the rules of implication, if a sentence of the form, "If A, then B" is true, and A is true, then B must be true. Here, A is "this sentence is true." But A is exactly the statement itself, so we've assumed the sentence is true, which makes the condition of the implication true. That means the conclusion, "Santa Claus exists," must also be true. But we didn't actually prove anything about Santa Claus. We simply embedded the claim inside a sentence that referred to itself and used the rules of implication to smuggle the conclusion out. This is the trick of Curry's paradox. It creates a self-reinforcing loop where the assumption of truth pulls any conclusion you want along with it. You might wonder what makes this different from other paradoxes. Isn't this just another version of the liar paradox, or maybe something like Russell's paradox in set theory? The answer is both yes and no. Like the liar paradox, Curry's paradox involves self-recognition. But unlike the liar, which deals in negation, "this sentence is false," Curry's paradox uses implication. That subtle shift from negation to conditional logic makes it even more insidious. Negation can sometimes be contained. We can build logical systems that allow contradictions to exist in isolated corners. But implication is harder to restrain. It flows outward. It spreads. Once Curry's paradox enters a system, it doesn't just produce a contradiction. It opens the door to every conclusion being equally provable. And that's a kind of collapse no logic can endure. This reveals a dangerous vulnerability in certain formal systems. In particular, Curry's paradox shows up in naive set theory, lambda calculus, and any language that allows unrestricted self-representation combined with a rule for implication. In systems that are too expressive, too generous with what they allow as sentences or sets, this paradox isn't just a quirky edge case. It becomes a fatal flaw. A single sentence constructed in Curry's mold can cause the system to prove that 2 + 2 = 5, or that all birds are secretly made of metal. Once any proposition can be proven by logic alone, logic itself becomes meaningless. The entire framework dissolves into noise. And yet, the paradox is built using rules that seem entirely reasonable. We want implication to work the way it does. If A implies B and A is true, then B should be true. We want our languages to be able to refer to themselves. After all, how else can we talk about truth, meaning, or knowledge in any rigorous way? But Curry's paradox is a warning. These desires are not always compatible. The very tools we use to build meaning can, if arranged just so, create holes in the structure. It's like designing a perfect machine, only to discover that if 2 gears spin in just the right way, they rip the engine apart. This makes Curry's paradox especially important in areas like computer science and the philosophy of mathematics. It shows that when designing a logical system, be it a programming language, a theorem prover, or even a framework for ethical reasoning, we must be careful about what kinds of self-restriction and implication we allow. Many modern formal systems now come with built-in restrictions to avoid Curry-like constructs. Some limit the kinds of sentences that can be written. Others carefully separate truth from provability. But even with these safeguards, the specter of Curry's paradox lingers. A reminder that consistency is not something that can be assumed. It must be vigilantly protected. On a more philosophical level, Curry's paradox touches on something even more universal: the danger of circular justification. It reflects how, in human reasoning, we sometimes build arguments that validate themselves, not through evidence or support, but through their own structure. Consider someone saying, "If I'm right, then I must be right," or "If this belief is true, then everything I believe is true." These aren't formal versions of Curry's paradox, but they echo the same pattern: truth defined by self-contained implication. In everyday life, this kind of reasoning can be seductive. It offers a sense of certainty, a closed loop where doubt is excluded by design. But just like the paradox, it's a hollow kind of certainty. It proves too much, and therefore, in the end, proves nothing at all. There's a strange beauty to the structure of Curry's paradox. It doesn't rely on deceit or error. Every step in the logic is clear, clean, and even elegant. It shows that paradoxes aren't always the result of misunderstanding or imprecision. Sometimes, paradox is the result of perfect clarity. When the components of reason line up too perfectly, they can twist into a loop, one that logic itself cannot escape. It's like a mirror facing another mirror. The reflection stretches to infinity but tells you nothing new. There is something profoundly humbling in this. Curry's paradox doesn't just challenge logic, it humbles it. And in that humility, we find wisdom. We begin to recognize the importance of boundaries, of knowing where to stop. Not every sentence should be allowed. Not every implication should be taken at face value. Sometimes, in the name of consistency, we must choose to limit our expressive power. This is not censorship, it is structure. It is the quiet discipline of a system learning to contain its own potential for collapse. It is the recognition that truth, if allowed to be anything, can quickly become nothing. But there's also comfort here, because Curry's paradox, like all great paradoxes, doesn't just destroy, it teaches. It sharpens our tools. It reveals hidden assumptions. It invites us to ask deeper questions about meaning, truth, and the power of language. In doing so, it doesn't reduce our world, it enriches it. Every paradox is a mirror, and in Curry's, we see how easily logic can be turned against itself. And we see, too, the beauty of restraint, of knowing when a sentence has said too much. So next time you find yourself staring at a conclusion that seems too convenient, too absolute, remember Curry's paradox. Remember that truth cannot be manufactured by implication alone. Remember that reason is powerful, but only when tethered to something more than its own reflection. Let this paradox be a soft reminder, not of failure, but of the subtlety of the structures we build. The systems of thought, language, and belief that shape our world are only as strong as their weakest sentence, and sometimes that sentence looks so harmless, so ordinary, that we don't notice until it's too late. Curry's paradox stands as a monument to this gentle danger. It is not a riddle to be solved, but a lesson to be understood. In its quiet unfolding, it reminds us that the foundation of logic must be built not just with power, but with care. Because the deeper we go into the architecture of truth, the more we discover that even truth itself must sometimes be guarded. Especially from the truths that prove everything. The lottery insurer's paradox. Imagine an insurance company, cool and calculated, built upon numbers and probabilities, quietly calculating risks that most people never even think about. Now imagine a lottery system, wild, unpredictable, thrilling, a realm where a single ticket can turn someone into a millionaire overnight. These two worlds, one grounded in actuarial logic and the other ruled by pure chance, seem almost like opposites, but now imagine them colliding. A person walks into the office of a large respected insurer and says, "I want to insure myself against winning the lottery." At first glance, it sounds like a joke, but the math, the logic, the paradox that follows is anything but funny. This is the beginning of the lottery insurer's paradox, a thought experiment that quietly unravels the foundations of rational risk, decision-making, and belief in probability itself. At the center of this paradox lies a simple yet bewildering question. What happens when someone wants to insure themselves against an outcome that is both extremely unlikely and also extremely life-changing? Suppose someone plays the lottery every week, and though the odds of winning are astronomically low, perhaps 1 in hundreds of millions, they ask for an insurance policy that pays out a small sum, say $100,000. If they do happen to win, in effect, they want the comfort of knowing that if they experience an extremely good outcome, they'll also get an additional payout, perhaps to soften the strange shock of sudden wealth, or to offset the taxes and costs that come with it. The insurer, accustomed to assessing risks with statistical models, might initially shrug this off. After all, what are the chances? But what follows is not just a matter of premiums and payout. It's a collision of logic and uncertainty, wrapped in a quiet contradiction. From a purely statistical standpoint, insuring against winning the lottery seems almost absurd. The chances of winning are so low that the premium for such a policy would also be extremely low. The insurer could charge $1 a year and still expect to turn a profit for millions of years before a single claim is ever made. It seems like free money. The risk is negligible. But this is where the paradox starts to stretch its fingers, because the very act of creating such insurance and pricing it cheaply forces the insurer to accept the legitimacy of the risk. And if the company accepts the legitimacy of the risk, it must prepare for the possibility of a claim. But now, here's the twist. If enough people buy the policy, and if someone wins, the company must pay. And if they refuse to insure because the odds are too low to matter, They contradict their entire business model, which is founded on the ability to quantify and price risk, no matter how rare. Let's imagine the paradox blooming further. Suppose millions of people start buying this insurance, just as they buy lottery tickets. Each pays a tiny premium. The insurer now collects millions in revenue, but the moment one person actually wins the lottery, they are suddenly entitled to a large payout. The company must honor its policy, but now a contradiction arises. If winning the lottery is so unlikely that it doesn't justify an insurance product, then no one should be able to insure it. Yet if it's insurable, then someone someday must win. The mere act of insuring against an outcome forces the acknowledgement that the outcome, however rare, is real. And in acknowledging it, the insurer becomes entangled in a contradiction. They believe the outcome is too rare to happen, yet they've written policies that guarantee it eventually will. The paradox deepens when we consider how belief interacts with rational action. If you believe that the chance of winning the lottery is negligible and that it's irrational to bet on it, then logically it should also be irrational to insure it. But from a business standpoint, if you can insure something for profit and the math checks out, then refusing to insure becomes irrational. So you now have two conflicting rationalities: the rationality of the individual who wants to protect themselves against an absurdly rare event, and the rationality of the insurer who wants to make profit from rare event coverage. Yet when combined, these two rationalities create an irrational system. Everyone is acting logically, and the result is an illogical outcome. That is the heart of the lottery insurer's paradox. Now imagine what happens when word spreads. More people begin to realize they can make a kind of hedge, buy a lottery ticket, and also buy insurance against winning. Now, they feel doubly protected. Either they lose and only lose the price of the ticket, or they win and collect both the lottery payout and an insurance windfall. The more this idea spreads, the more attractive it becomes. But the insurer, once swimming in small premiums, now faces a tidal wave of exposure. The rare event that was once safely ignored has become a loaded gun, ready to fire. In trying to monetize improbability, the company has accidentally invited its consequences. This is not a paradox of error. It is a paradox of perfectly rational steps leading to an unstable system. There's a psychological angle too. Most people are wired to fear losses more than they value gains. It's why we insure our cars, our homes, our health. But no one insures their lottery win, because it seems like the one thing in life that doesn't need insurance. The very act of imagining that outcome is hard for most people to take seriously, yet that's exactly what the paradox asks us to do. Take seriously something that seems absurd, and see what happens when it's treated with the same logic as everything else. The result is an eerie reflection of how our beliefs about risk, reward, and logic can be internally consistent and externally incoherent. Clever minds might try to escape the paradox by setting strict rules, only allowing such policies if a person can prove they've never bought a lottery ticket, or by capping the number of policies written. But such rules betray the very premise of insurance, that risk should be transferable, manageable, and priced. Once you begin making exceptions, you admit that some risks are not just improbable, but structurally corrosive. The lottery insurer's paradox shows that the line between absurdity and insurability is thinner than we think, and that crossing it, even just once, can unravel the assumptions we rely on to make decisions in uncertain environments. Even deeper, this paradox touches on the philosophy of belief. Suppose someone truly believes they will not win the lottery, so they buy insurance, thinking it's a harmless novelty. But that belief, so strong and so common, exists in millions of minds. And because it is shared, the insurer's logic seems safe. But belief is not a shield. Probability doesn't bend to perception. The paradox quietly reminds us that belief multiplied by millions becomes exposure. And in that exposure lies the truth. It doesn't matter what people believe about rare events. If they act on those beliefs together, the system begins to creak. So what does the lottery insurer's paradox ultimately reveal? It reveals that not all risks are compatible with the logic of insurance. Some events, by being too rare or too impactful, create a kind of existential threat to the systems that try to manage them. And more than that, it shows that the combination of rational agents can lead to irrational outcomes. Everyone can be logical, and yet the result is madness. This paradox, like all great paradoxes, doesn't just describe a problem, it holds up a mirror. In that mirror, we see the limits of our models, the fragility of our frameworks, and the quiet unpredictability that lurks behind the appearance of control. In a world increasingly shaped by algorithms, insurance models, and predictive analytics, the lottery insurer's paradox serves as a soft warning. A reminder that not everything improbable is ignorable. That logic, even when correct, can still lead us astray. That the future cannot always be insured, not because the math doesn't work, but because the structure of belief, action, and outcome can coil into something no equation can fully resolve. And so, as you imagine that simple sentence, "I want to insure myself against winning the lottery," let it sit in your mind like a stone in still water. Let the ripples move outward. Consider the systems you trust, the odds you accept, the logic you follow. Ask yourself what happens when improbable meets inevitable, when logic meets recursion, when belief meets math. And then perhaps let go of the need for perfect answers. Let the paradox be not a problem to solve, but a door into deeper questions. Because in those questions, quietly shimmering beneath the surface, lies the strange and infinite dance of reason and uncertainty. Prior's Sea Battle Paradox. Picture the night before a great naval battle. The sky is calm, the sea undisturbed, and a commander sits in quiet contemplation. The ships are ready, the men are prepared, and the future lies just out of reach. One might ask, will there be a sea battle tomorrow? And this question, so ordinary in form, becomes the doorway to one of philosophy's most elusive problems, Prior's Sea Battle Paradox. At first glance, it seems like a problem of prediction, or perhaps of decision, but as the reasoning unfolds, it touches on something far deeper, the nature of time, truth, determinism, and the mysterious status of future events. This paradox doesn't shout its mystery, it lingers in the air, quiet and haunting, like the distant sound of waves crashing in the dark. The paradox was introduced by philosopher Arthur Prior, a pioneer in temporal logic, who wanted to explore how we speak about the future. Specifically, Prior was interested in statements about what will or will not happen, and whether those statements can be considered true or false in the present moment. His version of the paradox involves a sea battle. Either there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or it seems obvious that this disjunction, there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or there won't, is logically true. One of the two possibilities must come to pass. This is the principle of bivalence. Every proposition must be either true or false, even before we know the outcome. But here is where the problem begins. If we accept the law of bivalence for future events, then we are saying that the statement, "there will be a sea battle tomorrow," is either already true or already false right now. That seems harmless until we consider what it implies. If it is true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then it seems the battle must happen. If it is already true, then it is already fixed. No decision, no action, no change of mind can alter it. And if it is false now, then the battle will not happen. And again, nothing can make it happen. The future is already determined. We are merely watching it unfold. This is where the calm surface begins to ripple. Prior found this deeply troubling. He was a champion of temporal logic, and he believed that statements about the future did not behave the same way as statements about the past or present. For him, saying that a future tense proposition is already true or false collapses the openness of time. It makes the future as fixed as the past, and this, in turn, undermines our sense of agency. If the outcome of tomorrow's sea battle is already settled, then our choices today, our planning, our fears, our hopes, are mere illusions. The future becomes a movie we are watching, not a story we are living. And yet, if we reject bivalence for future statements, we also break with classical logic. So which should we abandon? The openness of the future or the structure of truth? The sea battle paradox is, in essence, a dilemma between determinism and free will. If we believe in determinism, that everything that happens is fixed by prior states of the world, then it makes sense to say the future is already written. But if we believe in free will, in genuine choice, in a future not yet made, then it seems false to say that statements about tomorrow must already be true or false. Prior's insight was that logic alone cannot resolve this tension. The problem is not with the battle, it is with our expectations about truth, time, and meaning. We want logic to apply to every moment equally, but the future resists that application. It is not yet real. It is not yet decided. It lives in a different kind of existence. Imagine a world where every future event already has a truth value, like a book with all its pages written, even if unread. This is the world of eternalism, a view of time in which past, present, and future all coexist. From this perspective, it makes sense to say, there will be a sea battle tomorrow, and to believe that this statement is either true or false today, even if we don't yet know which. But many find this unsettling. It strips time of its flow. It removes the drama of decision. It transforms our lives into passive readings of a fixed script. Prior's challenge was to push back against this idea, not with mysticism, but with logic. He wanted a system in which the future is genuinely open, where propositions about what will happen are not yet settled. To support this vision, Prior developed what's called tense logic, a formal system in which the truth of a proposition depends on when it is said. In tense logic, a statement like, "There will be a sea battle tomorrow," is not evaluated simply as true or false, but as having a temporal context. It might not be true now, even if it becomes true tomorrow. This allows the future to remain indeterminate without denying the usefulness of future-directed language. It's a subtle but powerful shift. Instead of assigning fixed truth values to all statements at all times, Prior's system allows some truths to unfold only when their time arrives. The sea battle is not true now. It is merely possible. It becomes true or false when the event occurs. Yet even this elegant solution leaves some uncomfortable. Classical logicians worry that abandoning bivalence introduces uncertainty into the very core of reasoning. If some statements lack truth values, then what happens to argument, to proof, to deduction? Can we still reason effectively about the world if we allow some propositions to be neither true nor false? Prior's response was both radical and humble. Yes, we must, because the world is not made to suit logic. Logic must grow to suit the world. And in a world where the future is not yet real, we must accept that some truths are still waiting to be born. There is a quiet tension here between necessity and possibility. When we say, either the sea battle will happen or it won't, we are asserting a necessary truth. One or the other must be. But when we say, the sea battle will happen, we are asserting something different, a prediction, a commitment, a possibility. The paradox arises because we confuse these two levels. We assume that because the disjunction is necessarily true, one part of it must already be, but that leap is not justified. It's a mistake of perspective. We stand in the present, looking into the future, and try to apply the logic of certainty to a realm that has not yet crystallized. Pryor's sea battle paradox continues to stir debate among philosophers, linguists, and logicians. Some propose branching time models, where the future splits into many possible paths and only one becomes actual. In such models, the statement, "there will be a sea battle," is not true until a particular branch is chosen. Others advocate for three-valued logics, where propositions can be true, false, or indeterminate. Still others return to classical logic and accept determinism, embracing the idea that the future is fixed, even if unknown. Each response carries its own philosophical weight. None fully dissolves the paradox. And perhaps that is the point. The power of Pryor's sea battle paradox is not in its resolution, but in its framing. It forces us to look closely at the way we speak, the way we think, and the way we imagine time. It shows us that truth is not a simple label we can place on every sentence. Truth, like time itself, may be layered, evolving, context-bound, and this understanding can soften the way we experience the present when we realize that the future is not a fact waiting to be discovered, but a space waiting to be shaped. We begin to see our choices not as parts of a plan, but as seeds of possibility. So when you ask, "Will there be a sea battle tomorrow?" let the question echo. Let it rest in uncertainty. Let it remind you that some answers must wait. The logic of the future is not the logic of the past. It is not fixed, not silent, not still. It is living, breathing, unfolding, and in that unfolding, the paradox of the sea battle becomes not a problem to solve, but a truth to dwell in, a quiet reminder that not every truth exists now. Some truths arrive with time. Kaplan's Paradox of Demonstratives. Imagine standing in a room, pointing towards someone across the way, and saying, "That person is tall." You're not using a name or a description. You're relying on a gesture, a demonstration, something deeply anchored in context. The meaning of your sentence isn't found in the words alone, but in the act of pointing, in the situation, in the moment. This is the world of demonstratives, expressions like this, that, here, and now. They are deceptively simple, so ordinary that we rarely stop to question them. Yet buried within their familiarity is a deep philosophical puzzle, known as Kaplan's Paradox of Demonstratives, which quietly unsettles our understanding of meaning, reference, and self-expression. It's a paradox that doesn't shout with contradiction, it hums with mystery, nestled in the quiet mechanics of how language connects with reality. David Kaplan, a 20th century American philosopher of language, gave demonstratives serious philosophical attention in a way few others had. His work introduced a powerful framework for understanding how indexicals, words that depend on context, convey meaning. When you say, "I am here, now," the words "I," "here," and "now" change meaning depending on who is speaking, where they are, and when. Kaplan called the stable content conveyed across different uses the character of the expression, while the particular instance, the content, depended on the specific context of use. For example, "I" always refers to the speaker, no matter who is speaking. That's its character. But in a given utterance, "I" might refer to Kaplan himself, or to you, depending on the speaker. That's its content. This dual-layered view, character and content, allowed Kaplan to make sense of how language could remain systematic even when words like "this" and "now" seem to float freely, depending on their use. It seemed like a clean solution to the chaos of context. But then, quietly, a problem emerged. A problem that Kaplan himself recognized. It came from sentences that refer to themselves through demonstratives. Sentences like, "This very sentence is not true," or more subtly, "This sentence is not assertable." At first, they seem harmless, but when you try to evaluate them, When you try to pin down their content, you find yourself in a paradox. The sentence refers to itself demonstratively, and in doing so, breaks the very framework that was meant to explain it. To understand how the paradox works, let's look more closely. Suppose you write a sentence on a slip of paper. This sentence is not true. Then you hold it up and say, this sentence is not true. The word "this" now points at the sentence itself. It's a self-representative via demonstrative rather than a direct label, and suddenly you're entangled in something that resembles the liar paradox. If the sentence is true, then what it says must be the case. It is not true, but if it is not true, then what it says is true. We are caught in contradiction. And yet, what makes Kaplan's version unique is that the contradiction arises through the demonstrative, through a gesture, through a moment of attention, rather than through naming. Kaplan tried to navigate this paradox by carefully distinguishing between what is said and how it is said. He believed that demonstratives gain their meaning through the context of use, and that we can analyze their character systematically. But when a demonstrative points back at the expression it belongs to, when the sentence refers to itself using "this," we reach a point where the character and content collapse into each other. The expression no longer depends on external context, it folds inward. And when language folds inward on itself, paradox arises. This is the quiet rift at the center of Kaplan's theory, and it's one that touches on the limits of language and meaning. What's most haunting about Kaplan's paradox is how ordinary it feels. These are not strange philosophical terms or bizarre contrivances. They are the words we use every day. This, that, here, now. They are our anchors in the world. They ground our speech in place and time. And yet, when we let them turn inward, when we let them refer to their own utterance, the ground vanishes. It's like looking into a mirror and seeing not a reflection, but an abyss. The words that usually help us point at the world now point at themselves, and in doing so, destabilize their own meaning. There is a deep connection here with self-awareness. Just as the mind can think about its own thoughts, language can speak about its own words. But that recursive move, while powerful, is dangerous. It opens the door to contradiction, to self-discernment that cannot be resolved. Kaplan's work shows that the very structure that makes demonstratives useful, their ability to adapt to context, also makes them vulnerable when they refer to themselves. It's as if language, when turned on itself, becomes too sharp, too precise, and cuts into the logic that holds it together. Some have tried to escape the paradox by restricting how demonstratives can be used, by declaring that no demonstrative should refer to its own sentence, or that such uses are meaningless. But these solutions feel unsatisfying. They avoid the problem rather than resolving it, and they ignore the fact that self-explication is not just a quirk of language, it's a part of how we think. When we reflect, we refer back. When we narrate our own thoughts, we use language to turn inward. And so the paradox doesn't just live in words, it lives in us. It shows that even the most basic expressions of identity and location, I, here, now, this, can become tangled when we try to make them absolute. Kaplan himself did not see the paradox as a reason to reject demonstratives. Rather, he saw it as a signal that our understanding of context, reference, and selfhood is more complex than we like to believe. Demonstratives are not broken, they are simply revealing their limits. And in those limits, we glimpse something profound. That meaning is not fixed in symbols alone, but in the interplay between expression, context, and the shifting landscape of thought. The paradox is not a flaw in language, it is a sign of its depth. There is a quiet irony here. Demonstratives are supposed to be the clearest kind of reference. When we point and say, that, we imagine we are cutting through ambiguity. But Kaplan's paradox shows that even this clarity is conditional. Even the simplest gesture, pointing to a sentence and describing it, can twist into confusion. And that tells us something important about truth and knowledge. That what seems most direct is sometimes most deceptive. That certainty is not always found in simplicity, and that even our clearest words can lead us into shadow. In this way, Kaplan's paradox is more than a linguistic puzzle. It is a meditation on the fragility of understanding. It shows that the act of referring, of tying words to things, is not a mechanical task, but a philosophical one. It requires assumptions about the world, about ourselves, about time and place and identity. When those assumptions are pushed to the edge, they break, and in their breaking, they reveal the hidden structure beneath all communication, a structure built not only on syntax and semantics, but on context, awareness, and limitation. So what are we left with? Not a solution, but a deeper sense of the terrain, a recognition that demonstratives are not mere tools, they are portals. Each one opens a window into the moment, into the now, into the speaker, and when used with care, they connect us. But when turned inward, they remind us that language, like thought, cannot always hold its own weight. That there are questions which cannot be answered because they ask too much, and that in those moments, silence may carry more meaning than speech. Kaplan's paradox is not something to be solved and filed away, it is something to return to revisit in different moods, in different lights, in different stages of reflection. It is a quiet companion to the deeper journey of philosophy, a whisper from the boundaries of expression, reminding us that the most ordinary words, this, now, I, are not ordinary at all. They are mysteries in disguise, carrying the burden of presence, identity, and time. So next time you say this is true or that is important, pause for a moment. Feel the weight of the word this. Feel how it tries to capture a moment, a thought, a sentence, a self. Feel how it points not just outward, but inward. And let that pointing be a soft echo of Kaplan's insight, that the power of language is not in its certainty, but in its paradox, that meaning is not given, but made, and that even the smallest words can carry the deepest truths. Ross's paradox. Picture a quiet moment of ordinary language. Someone says to you, "Please mail this letter." It's a simple request, clear, straightforward, and politely phrased. You understand it immediately, without hesitation. You know what they want. They are asking you to place a letter in the mailbox, perhaps on your way to work or during a walk. There's no confusion, no complexity. But now imagine someone telling you with complete seriousness that this request also logically permits you to burn the letter, or throw it into the river, or launch it into space. Not because they misspoke, not because they were joking, but because the structure of language itself, under certain logical interpretations, allows such bizarre conclusions. Welcome to Ross's paradox, a strange and unsettling twist in the philosophy of language and deontic logic, the logic of permissions and obligations. Ross's paradox begins with a deceptively simple principle from classical logic. If A implies A or B, then any command to do A logically permits doing A or B. At first, this sounds harmless. If you're allowed to do one thing, then surely you're allowed to do that thing or something else. If I say, "You may sit down," then you may sit or stand. Sitting is still allowed. But in the case of obligations, this rule creates a problem. If I say you ought to mail the letter, then classical logic suggests you also ought to mail the letter or burn it. That's the paradox. The act of introducing a disjunctive option, mail or burn, logically preserves the original act, but intuitively, it radically changes its meaning. Mailing or burning the letter is no longer a focused obligation. It becomes a strange kind of freedom, where wildly inappropriate actions are folded into the scope of what's permitted, and that feels deeply wrong. What Ross observed was not just a flaw in casual conversation, but a serious tension between how logic works and how language is used. Deontic logic tries to formalize our intuitions about commands, permissions, and duties. But when it inherits rules from classical logic, like the principle of disjunction introduction, it begins to produce results that feel absurd. We know, intuitively, that you ought to mail the letter does not imply you ought to mail it or set it on fire, but the logic says otherwise. That mismatch between logical consequence and linguistic meaning is the heart of Ross's paradox. Let's slow down and walk through it more carefully. In classical propositional logic, if proposition A is true, then the disjunction A or B is also true, regardless of what B is. This is called disjunction introduction. If "it is raining" is true, then "it is raining," or "the moon is made of cheese" is also logically true. That's fine in pure logic, but in the real world, especially in ethical or practical contexts, we rarely speak in such abstract terms. When someone says, "You must do this," they are not merely asserting a proposition, they are issuing a directive. That directive carries meaning, intent, and often moral weight. And when logical rules like disjunction introduction are applied to such directives, strange results follow. Consider a more serious case. Suppose someone says, "You ought to donate to charity." Following the logic of disjunction, this would imply that you also ought to donate to charity, or punch someone in the face. After all, donate to charity or punch someone includes the original action. But no one would accept that as a valid moral conclusion. The introduction of an arbitrary, harmful alternative changes the moral landscape completely. The original obligation is diluted, even corrupted, by the absurdity of the added disjunction. This shows us that in matters of obligation, disjunctions don't behave as they do in neutral logic. The structure may hold, but the meaning breaks. Ross's paradox reveals a deeper truth, that natural language is not fully captured by formal logic. Language carries nuance, context, and intention. Logic is precise, mathematical, and detached. When we try to reduce ethical or directive language into purely logical form, we often lose something essential: the richness of meaning, the moral force of obligation, and the practical clarity of commands. All of these begin to slip away when forced into a rigid logical framework. This doesn't mean logic is useless. It means logic must be adapted. It must be sensitive to the domain it's applied to. Philosophers have explored many responses to Ross's paradox. Some propose modifying the logic itself, creating non-classical systems that don't allow disjunction in creation in deontic contexts. Others argue that obligations should be treated as prima facie duties, which can be overridden or contextualized, and that the problem lies in confusing obligations with permissions. Another response is to distinguish between material implication, the logical or, and exclusive choices that carry practical or ethical relevance. In this view, the disjunction mail or burn is not a real choice, because one of the options is morally or contextually unacceptable. But no matter the approach, the paradox has left a lasting mark on the philosophy of language and ethics. Ross's paradox also touches on a very human experience: the way we interpret authority, duty, and suggestion. Imagine a teacher telling a student, "You ought to finish your homework." The student replies, "Well, I figured I could either do my homework or play video games all night, and that's what I chose." This response might follow a certain logical form, but it completely misunderstands the meaning of the original statement. The teacher wasn't offering a menu of options, they were setting a clear expectation. The student, by introducing a disjunction, has transformed a directive into a hollow choice, and in doing so, they've exposed the very mechanism Ross described. In daily life, we rely on people to understand our intentions, even when our words are brief or imprecise. "Please close the window" is not taken to mean close the window or burn down the house. We assume a shared context, a background of reasonableness. Ross's paradox arises when we strip that background away, leaving only the logical skeleton. Without the warmth of context, Logic becomes too cold, too brittle to carry the weight of real communication. This is a reminder that language is not merely a vehicle for logical propositions. It is a living, breathing form of expression, full of expectation, emotion, and judgment. The paradox also connects to broader themes in ethics and law. Legal contracts, for instance, must be interpreted not just for their literal content, but for their intended obligations. A clause that says, "You shall deliver the goods by Friday," is not reasonably interpreted as, "You shall deliver the goods or destroy them." In these domains, logic is carefully balanced, with interpretation, precedent, and intention. Ross's paradox shows us what happens when that balance is lost, when obligation is reduced to mere formality and logic is divorced from meaning. In another light, Ross's paradox reflects our discomfort with infinite options. When logic allows disjunctions with anything, when A or B becomes permissible for any B, we lose the specificity that makes communication effective. "You should call your mother" becomes "You should call your mother," or "Swim to the bottom of the ocean." The absurdity lies not just in the disjunction itself, but in its implication, that the obligation is indifferent to the outcome. But we know that real obligations are purposeful. They are not indifferent. They aim to produce specific actions, not just any action that happens to fulfill a logical form. And so, Ross's paradox remains with us, not as a flaw to be fixed, but as a lens through which to better understand the boundary between language and logic. It invites us to think more carefully about the rules we apply to speech, to consider how context shapes meaning, to recognize that even the most basic commands carry layers of intention that logic alone cannot reveal. It reminds us that behind every ought is a world of expectation, relationship, and consequence. As we close this reflection, let Ross's paradox linger in your thoughts like a quiet echo. The next time you hear a command or give one, the next time you consider what ought to be done, remember that the words may be simple, but the meanings are not. Logic offers structure, but meaning lives in the space between. And sometimes, preserving meaning means knowing when to let go of the rules. The paradox of omniscience. Imagine a being that knows everything. Every fact, every thought, every possibility, every outcome before it ever happens. This is the idea of omniscience. Total and perfect knowledge. To be omniscient is to know not just what is, but what was, what will be, and what could have been. It is to exist beyond ignorance, beyond uncertainty, beyond the shadows that cloud every human understanding. For centuries, philosophers and theologians have wrestled with this concept, using it to describe the mind of God or the limits of ideal intelligence. But buried deep within the idea of omniscience is a contradiction so subtle, so disquieting, that it quietly unravels the very notion it tries to define. This is the paradox of omniscience, a puzzle that questions whether it is even possible for perfect knowledge to exist at all. At the heart of the paradox lies a seemingly simple question. Can an omniscient being know a truth that depends on not knowing it? If the answer is yes, then the being is no longer omniscient, because it knows what it is not supposed to know. If the answer is no, then again it is not omniscient, because there is something it does not know. This contradiction emerges in many different forms. Some come through logic, others come through free will, but all of them circle the same dark question. Is there a limit to what can be known? Even by a mind with no limits. One of the oldest versions of the paradox is the knower paradox. Suppose we define a sentence like this. This sentence is not known by any omniscient being. If the sentence is true, then there is something the omniscient being does not know, which means it is not omniscient. But if the being does know the sentence, then the sentence becomes false, because it claims to be unknown. Either way, the idea of perfect knowledge stumbles. Much like the liar paradox, this version turns language against itself, creating a loop that cannot be escaped by reason alone. It's a quiet reminder that even the most divine concepts are vulnerable to the tricks of self-reliance. Another form of the paradox appears when omniscience meets free will. Imagine an all-knowing being who knows every choice you will ever make. If your future decisions are known in advance, are they still free? If you cannot choose otherwise than what is already known, then your freedom is an illusion. But if you truly have free will, if you can choose differently, then the omniscient being must be wrong in at least some of its knowledge. The tension is deep. Omniscience demands that every truth, including future truths, is already known. Free will demands that the future is not fixed, that it remains open. When the two meet, they don't shake hands, they collide. Some have tried to resolve this tension by saying that omniscience includes knowledge of all possibilities, not just what will happen, but what could happen. The being knows every fork in the road, every possible path you might take, along with the actual one you end up choosing. This seems elegant, but it introduces a new problem. If the being knows that you will choose one specific path and also knows that you could have chosen another, how does that knowledge coexist? Is the possibility truly real if the outcome is already certain? Once again, we find that knowing too much may undermine the very freedom it tries to contain. There is also the paradox of prediction. If an omniscient being tells you that you will perform a certain action tomorrow, and you hear this prediction, you might choose to defy it simply to prove it wrong. But if you successfully change your behavior, the prediction turns out to be false. If it was false, the being wasn't omniscient. But if the being anticipates your rebellion and predicts that you will disobey, then by choosing to rebel, you end up doing exactly what was predicted. Either way, the very act of knowing the prediction can change the outcome, making it impossible to maintain perfect foreknowledge without disturbing the future. Omniscience in this light is not just knowledge, it is participation, and that entanglement makes pure knowing impossible. Consider another version of the paradox, rooted in personal privacy. Can an omniscient being know your private thoughts before you even think them? Can it know what you will dream, what you will feel, what you will love and fear, before those feelings emerge within you? If the answer is yes, then your inner life is not your own. If the answer is no, then omniscience is limited. But more importantly, if you know that someone knows everything, you will think. Does that change the nature of your thinking? The presence of total surveillance, even by a benevolent mind, transforms the meaning of privacy. It creates a world in which no mystery can survive. But perhaps mystery is essential for personhood, for creativity, for love. Perhaps there are parts of us that must remain unknown, even to the divine. Kaplan once suggested that omniscience might not mean knowing every sentence, but knowing all truths, a subtle but powerful distinction. Perhaps some sentences cannot be known because they are malformed or paradoxical, but truths are what remain when the fog clears. Still, the question lingers, can a being know all truths, including the truth that it cannot know some truths? We return again to the same circle, truth turning against itself, knowledge folding inward. The paradox doesn't lie in the details, it lies in the structure. To know everything is to collapse the space where discovery can happen, and in doing so, knowledge destroys the very process that gives it meaning. There is also the paradox of self-limitation. Can an omniscient being choose to forget something? If it can, then it is capable of limiting its own knowledge. But if it chooses to forget, is it still omniscient? Can it unknow something and remain unchanged? And if it cannot forget, then it is bound, unable to relinquish even a fragment of its mind. This leads us to a deeper philosophical question. Is freedom compatible with omniscience? Can an all-knowing mind also be a free mind? Or is it trapped, suffocating under the weight of perfect awareness, unable to choose anything but what it already knows? Some thinkers have tried to resolve the paradox by saying that omniscience applies only to what is logically possible. A being cannot know square circles, or the color of silence, or the name of the largest number. These things are contradictions, not truths. So the paradoxical sentences that undermine omniscience, like, "This sentence is not known," are simply ruled out. But this solution feels like a boundary, not an answer. It defines omniscience by what it cannot do, and in doing so, shrinks it. The paradox doesn't disappear. It retreats to the shadows, waiting to re-emerge through some other twist of language or logic. Perhaps the most haunting version of the paradox of omniscience is existential. If a being knows all things, including all beauty, all sorrow, all joy, and all suffering, how can it bear the weight? To know every cry ever uttered, every loss ever felt, every fear ever whispered into the dark, how does such knowledge not crush the spirit? Can perfect knowledge coexist with perfect peace? Or does omniscience come at the cost of detachment, a separation from experience so total that the being no longer feels what it knows? If so, then omniscience may not be perfection. It may be a kind of cold eternity, where nothing is ever new, and no surprise ever stirs the soul. This brings us to a quiet conclusion. Perhaps not knowing is essential for life. Perhaps the human mind, with its gaps and blind spots, its questions and confusions, is not a failure, but a feature. Maybe it is through mystery that we grow, through ignorance that we learn, through uncertainty that we love. Omniscience in its totality might not be a divine gift, but a philosophical mirror, one that shows us that perfect knowledge is not the goal of being, but its end. In the absence of unknowing, there is no journey, and without journey, there is no meaning. And so the paradox of omniscience remains, not as a flaw in logic, but as a soft riddle about the shape of understanding. It tells us that to know everything is to stop becoming, that to hold all truth is to release all wonder, and that perhaps the greatest wisdom is knowing what not to know. Loeb's Paradox. In the quiet depths of formal logic, there is a place where certainty becomes unstable, where even the act of proving something true can lead you down a corridor of contradiction. That place is home to Loeb's Paradox, a subtle, intricate puzzle that resides not in the surface-level logic of everyday life, but in the internal mechanisms of proof and belief. It is not as loud as the liar paradox, nor as strange as Russell's paradox, but it is just as powerful. It slips in through the back door of reasoning, showing that if you allow a system to reason about its own beliefs, you might end up proving something not because it is true, but because the system believes that if it were provable, then it must be true. This paradox was introduced by Martin Hugo Loeb in 1955, and it reveals a fascinating crack in the foundations of self-referential logic and formal arithmetic. To understand the heart of Loeb's paradox, we need to step into a world where statements can talk about their own provability. This is the landscape of mathematical logic, where we encode not just facts about numbers, but also statements about proofs themselves. In this world, a sentence can say something like, "This statement is provable." That may sound innocent enough, but once you give a system the ability to express that idea, new and strange consequences begin to emerge. Loeb's theorem shows that in any system strong enough to express arithmetic and capable of reasoning about provability, something unexpected happens. If the system can prove that if a statement is provable then it is true, then it can prove the statement itself. This may sound like a technical curiosity, but its implications are far-reaching. Imagine a sentence that says, "If I am provable, then I am true." That's a conditional statement, and on the surface, it seems reasonable. After all, we want our logical systems to be sound. We want provable things to also be true. But Loeb's theorem reveals that if you can prove that if this statement is provable, then it is true, then you can actually prove the statement itself. The paradox lies in the fact that the system, once it has this self-referential machinery, begins to collapse the gap between proof and truth. The consequence is that the very act of asserting conditional provability leads to full belief in the claim. It's like a feedback loop. The belief in the provability pulls the statement into being, whether it deserved to be there or not. This becomes unsettling when you realize what it means. Suppose we insert any arbitrary claim into that structure. Let's say all unicorns are green. If we can prove that if the statement all unicorns are green is provable, then it is true. Lobb's theorem allows us to conclude that all unicorns are green is provable. In other words, we can derive the truth of a statement not by proving the statement itself, but simply by proving that if it were provable, then it would be true. It sounds circular, it sounds like a trick, but it's not. It is a real feature of logical systems that can express their own proofs. And that's what makes it so quietly dangerous. Lobb's paradox arises from a deep interplay between meta-mathematics and formal systems. It tells us something surprising, that once a system is expressive enough to reflect on its own reasoning, it becomes vulnerable to strange inferences. This is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that no consistent formal system can prove all the truths about the natural numbers. Gödel introduced the idea that statements can refer to their own unprovability. Lobb took it a step further. He explored what happens when statements refer to their own conditional provability. That small shift from unprovability to provability creates an unexpected pathway to conclusion, one that bypasses the usual route of direct argument. But why does this matter beyond abstract logic? Because formal systems underlie much of our modern understanding of computation, mathematics, and even aspects of artificial intelligence. When we build systems that can reason about their own behavior, we are stepping into Lobbian territory. For example, if a machine can analyze its own code and make conclusions about what it can or cannot prove, then Lobb's theorem becomes relevant. It tells us that certain kinds of self-referential beliefs can shortcut directly to acceptance, turning conditional reasoning into full commitment. And if the wrong kind of statement sneaks into that loop, the system might end up accepting claims that it cannot truly justify. This raises profound questions about belief, trust, and reflection. Can a system trust its own beliefs about provability? Can it distinguish between statements that are conditionally reliable and those that are absolutely reliable? In human terms, it's like saying, if I believe I am right, then I must be right, and then accepting that belief as truth. We know how dangerous that can be. It opens the door to self-reinforcing ideologies, to systems of belief that validate themselves simply because they believe themselves valid. Lobb's paradox is a formal version of that danger. It shows how belief about belief can create a runaway effect, bypassing the need for actual evidence. What's remarkable is that Lobb's theorem is not an error. It is a provable theorem in formal logic. It is not a bug, it is a consequence of the architecture. This makes it even more haunting. We can't simply dismiss it as a mistake. We must face it, understand it, and decide how to live with it. Philosophers and logicians have responded in various ways. Some propose weakening the system so that certain forms of self-reference are disallowed. Others suggest that we need more refined distinctions between different levels of proof and belief. But none of these responses erase the core insight. Self-bias in systems of logic is deeply tricky. It opens the door to paradox not through contradiction, but through silent escalation. Lobb's paradox also invites a kind of philosophical introspection. How do we know what we know? Can we ever fully trust a claim just because we trust the system that produced it? When we reflect on our own reasoning, do we risk blurring the line between assumption and conclusion? These are not just abstract puzzles, they are questions about the foundations of reason itself. Every time we think about our own thoughts, we step into this loop. Every time we say, if I'm right, then I must be right, we echo the structure of Lobb's paradox. It is not just a formal artifact, It is a mirror of human cognition. There is also a strange beauty in the paradox. It reveals the fragile dance between truth, proof, and belief. In our pursuit of certainty, we built systems to capture truth through formal reasoning, and those systems, when given the power to look inward, began to surprise us. They did not collapse in flames. They whispered strange things. They told us that believing in the power of proof could sometimes create proof, that conditional truth could sneak its way into the hall of unconditional truth. That logic, like consciousness, changes when it becomes self-aware. We might ask, is there a way to resolve Lob's paradox? Can we draw a clear boundary between safe self-preservation and dangerous recursion? Perhaps. But that solution would come at a cost. To remove the paradox, we would have to weaken the expressiveness of our systems. We would have to silence certain kinds of reflection, restrict the ability to talk about provability itself. In doing so, we would gain stability but lose depth. We would trade richness for safety. And so, like many paradoxes, Lob's invites not a solution, but a deeper awareness. It tells us not to be careless with reflection, to be mindful when systems begin to speak of themselves. As we close this long reflection, let us remember what Lob's paradox ultimately shows us: that truth is not just about what is, but about how we know it. That reasoning about reasoning introduces complexity that cannot be ignored. That proof, when turned inward, does not always behave like proof turned outward, and that in every act of self-refusation, there is a kind of risk, a quiet instability that reminds us we are standing on conceptual ice. Lob's paradox is not a flaw, it is a feature, a message from the architecture of logic itself, a whisper from the deep foundations of thought, telling us that even the most rigorous systems carry shadows within. And those shadows, while not always dangerous, deserve our attention. They are the places where logic dreams of itself. Goodman's new riddle of induction. Imagine you are observing emeralds. One by one, you lift each stone into the light and note that it is green. You repeat this process hundreds of times. Each emerald, without exception, is the same deep green, confirming your growing expectation that all emeralds are, by nature, green. This is the process of induction, learning through repeated observation, projecting past patterns into the future. It's the foundation of how we generalize knowledge, build scientific theories, and navigate daily life. But then, like a quiet thunderclap in the mind, philosopher Nelson Goodman steps in with a riddle that gently shakes the entire foundation. A riddle not of logic or numbers, but of language and expectation. A riddle that asks, what if every emerald you've ever seen is not actually green, but grew? The word grew may sound like nonsense at first, like a made-up term with no real meaning. But in Goodman's carefully crafted paradox, it has a precise definition. An object is grew if it is observed before a certain time, say January 1st, 2100, and is green, or if it is observed after that date and is blue. This hybrid concept combines color and time into one predicate. According to the definition, all emeralds seen before the chosen date are grew because they are green and seen early. So the next time you examine an emerald and find it green, you're not just confirming that it's green, you're also confirming that it's grew. And here lies the trap. Based on your observations so far, you might conclude that all emeralds are green, but you could just as logically conclude that all emeralds are grew. After all, the evidence supports both. Every emerald you've observed is both green and grew. So which prediction is more justified? That future emeralds will continue to be green, or that they will become blue after the designated time in accordance with the definition of grew? This is Goodman's riddle. It doesn't question whether induction works. It asks why certain inductions feel right while others do not. Why does green seem like a more natural category than grew, when both are equally supported by past evidence? This is not a trivial puzzle. It strikes at the heart of scientific reasoning. For centuries, thinkers have relied on the idea that if we observe enough of something, we can safely infer a general rule. The sun has risen every day, so it will rise tomorrow. Swans we've seen are white, so swans are white. But Goodman's riddle reveals that the success of induction depends not just on the data. If we use ordinary words, like green, the prediction seems stable. But if we use invented terms like grew, the same evidence leads to wildly different futures. This shows that induction is not just about what we see. Goodman called this the new riddle of induction, to distinguish it from David Hume's classical version. Hume's problem was that induction lacks a rational justification. We use it because it works, but we cannot prove that it will always work. Goodman goes further. He accepts that we use induction, but asks why we prefer some inductive hypotheses over others. Why do we project green instead of grew? The evidence supports both equally. So our preference must come from somewhere else, not from the observations themselves, but from deeper principles about what counts as a valid rule. This leads us into the realm of projectability. Some predicates, like green, are considered projectable. They can be extended from past to future cases in a meaningful way. Others, like grew, are not. But what makes one predicate projectable and another not? Is it familiarity, simplicity, utility? Goodman challenges us to define these criteria without relying on circular reasoning. We can't just say green is better because it has worked in the past, because grew has worked in the past too, up until the arbitrary cutoff. We can't say green is simpler, because that depends on how we define simplicity, and in a world where grew is the basic concept, green would seem the unnatural one. The riddle forces us to confront the possibility that our entire framework for learning from experience may be shaped more by convention than by logic. There is a quiet terror in this idea. If the success of our predictions rests not only on observation, but on unspoken assumptions about which words and categories are natural, then certainty begins to erode. What if our sciences are built not on raw truth, but on historical habits of description? What if, had we grown up in a culture that used grew instead of green, our predictions about emeralds and the world would be entirely different? This isn't to say that science is invalid. It is to say that science, like language, may be more contingent than we assume, that the world does not simply reveal its structure to us, but that we carve it with the tools of thought and speech. Philosophers have responded to Goodman's challenge in various ways. Some argue that we prefer green because it is entrenched, a predicate we've used often and successfully. Others suggest that green aligns better with our sensory apparatus, or with the way physical properties behave over time. Still others propose that grew is too temporally unstable. It switches properties midstream, while green remains consistent. But these defenses, while appealing, are not logically airtight. They rely on assumptions that Goodman's riddle was designed to question. The riddle is not about whether grew is weird, it is about why we treat it as weird, even when it perfectly fits the data. Goodman's riddle also reveals something important about learning and generalization. When we teach a child the word dog, we point to dogs, but we also mean not just these dogs, but all future dogs the child will meet. The child must generalize, and in doing so, they must pick out the right features: 4 legs, barking, fur, not incidental ones like seen on a Tuesday or wearing a red collar. Goodman's insight is that this process of generalization depends on more than exposure. It depends on a tacit background of what counts as a reasonable category. And this background, while often invisible, shapes the entire structure of our knowledge. There is also a poetic layer to Goodman's riddle. It reminds us that the world does not come to us neatly labeled. The universe is raw and unformed until we give it names. until we draw boundaries and say, this counts and this does not. The difference between green and grue is not in the emeralds, it is in the concepts we bring to them. The riddle humbles us. It shows that the map we make of the world is not dictated by the world alone. It is drawn through the lens of our language, our culture, our expectations. And yet, through that map, we navigate with surprising success. In this light, Goodman's new riddle of induction is not just a challenge to philosophy, it is a meditation on the fragility of knowledge. It shows how deeply our certainty rests on unexamined choices about how to divide and describe reality. It shows that data is not enough, that facts do not speak for themselves, that even our most rigorous methods of reasoning rely on subtle, often invisible assumptions about what kinds of predictions are legitimate. And in recognizing this, we become more careful thinkers, more aware of the background rules we usually take for granted. This is not a call to abandon science or to doubt the usefulness of induction. Rather, it is a call to see knowledge not as a mirror, but as a construction that can be strong, beautiful, and useful, but one that is always shaped by the hands that build it. Goodman's riddle whispers that even the most familiar truths, like the green of emeralds, are born from choices about how to see, and that behind those choices lies a deeper mystery, the mystery of why we choose the rules we do and how we know which ones to trust. And so, as we return to the image of the emerald in your hand, think again about what it means to call it green. That simple word carries within it a world of assumptions, a history of observations, a silent agreement between speaker and listener. It is a word that works, but Goodman's riddle reminds us that it works because we have chosen to let it work. That beneath every act of reasoning, there is a quiet act of faith. Faith in our categories, our language, our sense of what makes sense. And in that space between observation and explanation, between experience and expectation, lies the riddle that never goes away. Sleight of hand paradox. Picture a magician standing silently on a dimly lit stage, his eyes scanning the room with practiced stillness. He raises one hand, shows it empty, and in a graceful motion reveals a shining coin from thin air. The audience gasps. They know it's a trick, and yet they see no deception. The hand was empty, and then it wasn't. They were watching carefully, expecting a trick, and still they were fooled. This moment of awe, of mystery, of playful betrayal, lies at the heart of the sleight of hand paradox, a philosophical puzzle disguised as a stage performance. It's not just about misdirection or surprise. It's about what happens when knowing that you're being tricked doesn't protect you from being deceived. The paradox begins not with the trick itself, but with the relationship between perception and awareness. A spectator sees the magician's hand and believes it to be empty. They believe this not blindly, but because they are looking directly at it, under light, with attention sharpened by the expectation of deception. And yet, the magician fools them anyway. The paradox is not that deception occurs. Deception is expected. The paradox is that deception succeeds even when it is actively anticipated and when every rational defense is in place. It's not the mind that is being tricked. It's the mechanisms of trust that underlie even our most focused perceptions. This creates a tension between what we know and what we see. Rationally, the observer might say, "I know this is a trick. I know that the hand only appears to be empty." But in the moment of observation, the visual system reports emptiness with complete authority. The hand appears empty, undeniably so. The mind accepts this as truth, not because it wants to be fooled, but because it has no alternative data to override the visual input. When the coin appears, the surprise isn't just about the object, it's about the failure of perception itself. It's the moment the mind realizes that what it believed it saw was never real. This paradox is not confined to magic. It exists in many areas of human experience, especially in cases where self-awareness fails to prevent illusion. Consider the person who knows that advertisements are manipulative, who understands the psychology of marketing, and yet finds themselves moved by a commercial. Or the skeptic who dismisses superstition, but hesitates to walk under a ladder. These are sleights of hand on a broader scale, moments when cognitive understanding fails to protect us from emotional or perceptual influence. The paradox is that we can be fully aware of a mechanism of deception and yet be just as vulnerable to it as those who are unaware. What makes the sleight-of-handed paradox so compelling is that it challenges the idea that knowledge is power. We often assume that if we know how something works, we are immune to its effects. The magician shatters this belief. He invites us to witness the trick with open eyes and open minds, and then shows us how even the prepared mind can be deceived. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a feature of cognition. Our minds rely on shortcuts, assumptions, and filters, tools for navigating a world too complex to perceive in full detail. The magician exploits these tools not by hiding them, but by using them openly. This reveals an important philosophical truth. Awareness does not equal control. We may know that our senses are fallible, that our minds are susceptible to suggestion, but that knowledge doesn't override the mechanisms themselves. Just as seeing the gears inside a clock doesn't stop time, seeing the gears of deception doesn't prevent the illusion. In fact, it may deepen the paradox, because now we are not just deceived, we are deceived while knowing we are being deceived. It is a second-order illusion, a meta-deception, where the act of watching closely becomes part of the trap. There is something deeply human in this paradox. We are creatures who strive to understand the world, to pierce the veil of appearances, to get beneath the surface. But the sleight-of-handed paradox suggests that understanding is not always the antidote to illusion. Sometimes understanding is the illusion. The magician teaches us that clarity is fragile, that certainty is performative, that what we see is not always what is there, and he does so not by tricking the naive, but by inviting the wise into a game where wisdom itself becomes a vulnerability. The paradox also touches on a broader theme, the relationship between expectation and experience. When we expect to be fooled, we prepare ourselves, we guard our attention, we focus, we think critically. And yet the very structure of expectation can be used against us. A skilled magician knows that a spectator expecting a trick will look in the wrong place, that they will be drawn to movement, not stillness, that their focus can be manipulated precisely because it is alert. The paradox is that our effort to see clearly can be turned into the tool of our own deception. This leads to a deeper insight about how we construct reality. Perception is not passive, it is an active interpretation, shaped by attention, belief, context, and prior knowledge. What we perceive is not the world as it is, but the world as our minds assemble it, and because that assembly is so seamless, we don't notice the gaps. The magician doesn't hide the coin in darkness, he hides it in expectation. He exploits the rules of perceptual assembly, and in doing so he shows us that seeing is not believing, believing is seeing, and belief can be guided, even when it resists guidance. The sleight-of-hand paradox also speaks to the limits of introspection. We like to think we can understand our own minds, that we can look inward and uncover the processes beneath perception. But the magician shows that introspection is not a window, it's a mirror. We cannot observe the mechanism while it is running. The very act of perception prevents us from perceiving how perception is working. And so the trick works, not because we are unaware, but because we are incapable of being fully aware in the moment it matters most. Some might argue that this paradox is merely a feature of staged entertainment, that it belongs to the world of illusion and distraction. But consider how often this pattern repeats in real life. We believe we are objective, and yet we fall prey to cognitive biases. We trust our memories even as they change with each retelling. We see order in randomness, patterns in noise. The world is full of sleights of hand, not by magicians, but by nature, by society, by our own minds. The paradox isn't about deception. It's about the structure of belief in a world that resists clarity. There is a lesson here, not of skepticism, but of humility. The sleight of hand paradox doesn't suggest we give up on truth. It suggests that we approach it with a gentler grip, that we recognize the limits of perception, the fragility of insight, the ease with which confidence can be manufactured. It invites us to see that awareness is not the final defense. It is the beginning of a more careful journey, one in which we watch not just what is shown, but how it is shown. Not just what we believe, but why we believe it. And perhaps there is beauty in this vulnerability. Perhaps the fact that we can be fooled, even when we try not to be, is not a flaw, but a reminder that mystery remains. That surprise is still possible. That the world, for all our theories and models, still contains wonder. The magician, after all, is not just a deceiver. He is a storyteller. He shows us the paradox not to mock us, but to return us to the moment of awe. A moment where knowing and not knowing live side by side, and where truth becomes something to experience, not just to possess. So the next time you see a coin vanish, or a card appear in an impossible place, let the paradox linger. Let it remind you that even with eyes wide open, even with a mind fully alert, illusion is always possible. Not because we are weak, but because we are human. Because we live in a world where what we see is shaped by how we look, where what we know is filtered by what we expect. The sleight of hand paradox is not just a trick. It is a gentle nudge from the edge of perception, telling us that truth is a dance, not a destination, a dance between what is shown and what is hidden, between knowing and wondering, between seeing and believing. Buridan's bridge paradox. Imagine a quiet bridge spanning a calm river, the kind of place where thought lingers longer than footsteps. Now imagine two figures standing at either end of that bridge. On one side, Socrates, the philosopher known for relentless questioning. On the other, a powerful ruler ready to exercise judgment. The ruler issues a decree. If you say something true, I will let you cross. If you say something false, I will throw you into the river. It's a simple challenge of logic, of truth and consequence. Socrates steps forward, his voice calm, and says, "You will throw me into the river." And just like that, with one sentence, the entire system short-circuits. This is Buridan's bridge paradox, a quiet contradiction that sits at the edge of justice, language, and logic. The paradox is named after Jean Buridan, a 14th century philosopher and logician who used it to explore the nature of truth, promises, and conditional reasoning. At its heart, the puzzle is simple. When Socrates says, "You will throw me into the river," the ruler must now determine whether the statement is true or false. If the ruler throws Socrates into the river, then the statement was true. But according to the original rule, true statements must be rewarded with safe passage, not punishment. So the ruler has violated his own condition. On the other hand, if the ruler allows Socrates to cross the bridge, then the statement must have been false. But false statements are to be punished by being thrown into the river. No matter what the ruler does, he breaks his own rule. The statement collapses the logic of the system in on itself. This paradox is not just a clever trick. It's a profound challenge to how we handle self-referential statements and conditional rules. The sentence Socrates utters refers not just to the situation, but to the very judgment that will be made in response to the sentence. It's a statement whose truth depends entirely on how the authority responds to it, and in doing so it reveals something uncomfortable, that some systems cannot consistently evaluate certain inputs, because the act of evaluation changes the nature of the input itself. This recursive tension is the essence of the paradox. We've seen echoes of this pattern in other logical puzzles. The liar paradox, for example, challenges us with the statement, "This sentence is false. If it's true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true." Buridan's bridge paradox works in a similar loop, but it adds an element of authority and consequence. Here, the paradox isn't just abstract, it's tied to action. The bridge keeper must make a decision, and the paradox reveals that no decision can be made without contradiction. This blends the world of logic with that of ethics, responsibility, and power. One of the deeper questions raised by Buridan's paradox is whether conditional promises can be logically airtight. When the ruler says, "If your statement is true, I'll let you cross," it seems like a clear contract. But Socrates' statement manipulates the contract itself. It forces the ruler into a corner where any outcome violates the original agreement. This highlights a broader issue in logic and language, that rules can be subverted by the way they are applied, especially when self-refutation is involved. A rule that works perfectly in most cases can be unraveled by a clever edge case. Philosophers have long wrestled with how to resolve Buridan's bridge. One approach is to deny that Socrates' statement is either true or false. Perhaps it occupies a third category, indeterminate or undefined. In such a system, the original rule simply doesn't apply, because it assumes that all statements must have a clear truth value. This would allow the ruler to act without contradiction, perhaps by pausing the test altogether. But such solutions are unsatisfying to many, because they suggest that the logic system needs exceptions to stay functional. Others argue that the real problem lies not in the statement, but in the structure of the promise, that it is the conditional nature of the rule itself that opens the door to paradox. Buridan's bridge also raises interesting questions about justice and punishment. The ruler's rule is a form of conditional justice, rewards for truth, punishment for lies. But Socrates shows that such justice can be gamed, that when rules are too rigid, they can be turned against themselves. This is not just a logical insight, it's a political one. Systems of justice, law, or authority must be designed to handle ambiguity, manipulation, and edge cases. If they assume a perfect world of binary decisions, they can be undone by a single paradoxical statement. There's also a psychological dimension to this puzzle. Socrates knows the ruler's rule. He understands the logic it operates on, and he uses that knowledge to create a trap. This is a form of meta-awareness where understanding the system allows one to challenge the system. It mirrors how humans often interact with institutions, laws, and even relationships. When we understand the rules deeply enough, we find the crack, and sometimes those cracks aren't flaws, they're features, showing us where rigidity becomes fragility. Socrates, in this thought experiment, becomes not just a logician, but a critic of systems that don't account for the complexity of real interaction. We can even stretch this paradox into the realm of artificial intelligence and computation. In designing systems that respond to inputs based on rules like chatbots or automated legal frameworks, we must ask, what happens when an input reflects on the rule itself? When a question is not just about content, but about how the system decides. Buridan's bridge shows that some inputs cannot be consistently evaluated by the system they challenge. This is a core insight behind things like Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the broader limits of formal systems. There will always be sentences, situations, or challenges that exist outside the reach of the rules they question. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of Buridan's paradox is that it forces us to confront the limits of consistency. We value consistency in reasoning, in ethics, in systems of governance. But consistency often depends on clean boundaries between inputs and rules. Socrates' statement crosses that boundary. It becomes both an input and a test of the system's rule. And when that happens, we see that any system that is strong enough to talk about its own rules is vulnerable to contradiction. This isn't a flaw in thought, it's a feature of reflection. When thought turns on itself, paradox is never far away. This reflection leads us to a kind of philosophical humility, We see that logic, while powerful, is not invincible, that even the most well-structured systems of reasoning can be folded by a single clever sentence, that truth, when entangled with action, becomes difficult to parse. Buridan's bridge is more than a trick, it is a lens through which we see the vulnerability of rigid structures, the challenge of conditional justice, and the power of language to subvert even the clearest rules. In the end, the paradox is not meant to be solved, it is meant to be witnessed. Like the bridge itself, it spans a divide, not between two shores, but between certainty and uncertainty, between rule and exception, between knowing and choosing. It teaches us to look carefully at the promises we make, the logic we trust, and the systems we build. It whispers that no system, however elegant, is safe from the clever mind that understands it too well. So imagine the bridge once more, the water flowing gently below. Socrates stands with his paradoxical sentence, and the ruler must decide. There is no choice that satisfies the rule. There is only the awareness that some questions reshape the rules they are asked within. And in that awareness, we find not just confusion, but clarity. A kind of stillness that comes from seeing the edge of logic itself. The Shoemaker's Paradox. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that everything feels exactly the same. The bed, the walls, the light filtering in from the window. It all looks unchanged. Your body moves as it always does, your thoughts flow uninterrupted, there's no pain, no confusion, no disorientation. And yet, something remarkable has happened. Today, unbeknownst to you, your sense of time has been altered. You are experiencing a day, but not in the way others are. The day you believe you are living, Wednesday perhaps, is not the day the world outside believes it to be. Everything about your memory, your perception, your continuity of consciousness remains intact. But something is missing. The ability to know the true temporal location of your experience. This curious disjunction between awareness and reality sits at the heart of Shoemaker's Paradox, a thought experiment that challenges what it means to know who and when you are. The paradox was first introduced by the philosopher Sidney Shoemaker in 1963 as a way of exploring identity and the nature of time. At first glance, it doesn't appear to be a paradox in the traditional sense. There's no glaring contradiction, no semantic trap. But as you follow the implications of the scenario, you begin to see the strange, shifting terrain beneath the surface. Shoemaker invites us to imagine a world where certain regions of the Earth experience periodic blackouts, days in which all activity halts completely. Machines stop running, people stop moving, time itself seems to pause. These blackouts are not random, they follow a regular, predictable pattern. Different regions experience them on different days, such that no two regions go dark at the same time. The people in each region are unaware of the blackout days in other places. And here's the crucial detail. During a blackout, a region does not age. Biological processes freeze. Clocks stop ticking. Consciousness is suspended. In this scenario, Shoemaker asks a deceptively simple question. How would anyone ever know that a blackout had occurred? From the inside, everything would seem normal. When consciousness resumes, it picks up exactly where it left off. There is no memory of the blackout, no biological evidence, no internal sense that anything has changed. And yet, from the outside, from the perspective of the universe, time has passed. One region has aged a day less than the others. People have lost a slice of time, though it was taken so cleanly that they cannot tell it's gone. And here the paradox blooms. If something can happen that alters your temporal position without leaving any trace, can you still claim to know what day it is? This puzzle forces us to question the reliability of temporal self-location. Most of us believe that we know when we are. We may forget names or places, but time feels secure. It flows in one direction. It leaves behind memories. It carries us forward with consistency. But Shoemaker's paradox shows that our sense of time may be more fragile than we think. If our memory and perception can be flawlessly adjusted to match a manipulated timeline, then temporal knowledge becomes vulnerable to external control. It means that even in the absence of illusion or error, we might still be wrong about the moment we're living in, not because we were deceived, but because our continuity was interrupted invisibly. This leads to a deeper question about what it means to be a person over time. We typically understand personal identity as something that stretches across moments, a thread of memory, character, and intention linking yesterday to today to tomorrow. But Shoemaker's paradox introduces the idea that this thread can be snipped and reattached without our awareness, that we can jump forward in time, losing pieces of our experience, and still believe in an unbroken line. If that's possible, then personal identity may not be as tightly bound to continuous consciousness as we thought. It might depend not on what actually happens, but on what we believe has happened. This opens a troubling possibility that our sense of self is preserved not by truth, but by seamless fabrication. There are echoes here of other paradoxes, like Locke's thought experiments about memory and identity, or modern discussions of simulated consciousness. If a brain were paused and then restarted later, with no awareness of the pause, is it the same person? If we simulate your mind perfectly, copy it into a new body, and resume your life without interruption, are you still you? Shoemaker's paradox offers a temporal version of these questions. It asks whether time must be experienced continuously to preserve selfhood, or whether gaps can be silently bridged without consequence. It suggests that our confidence in the present is not based on interrupted time, but on narrative coherence. One way to escape the paradox might be to say that it doesn't matter. If no one notices the missing day, and if every system resumes as if nothing happened, then perhaps the blackout isn't real in any meaningful sense. It's like the old question: if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? But this answer doesn't satisfy. Because in Shoemaker's world, the blackout isn't imaginary. Time does pass. Other regions experience it. The blackout alters the future in subtle but cumulative ways. People age unevenly. The calendar continues. The consequences are real, even if the experience is not. And this creates a tension between external time, objective, measurable, universal, and internal time, subjective, remembered, lived. The paradox shows that these two kinds of time can come apart, that what we live is not necessarily what is. This has profound implications for our understanding of knowledge. Philosophers have long distinguished between propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and phenomenal knowledge, knowing what something feels like. Shoemaker's paradox shows that we might lack both. We cannot know that today is truly today if our experience can be perfectly replicated after a blackout, and we cannot feel the difference because the discontinuity leaves no trace. This suggests that there are facts about ourselves that we are fundamentally incapable of accessing, not because we are ignorant or misinformed, but because those facts are, by their nature, unreachable from within. There's something unsettling about this. We like to think that self-acknowledge is privileged, that we have special access to our own minds, our own presence in time. Shoemaker's paradox suggests that this access is more limited than we imagine, that we can be mistaken not just about our beliefs or our emotions, but about our place in history. We can be time-shifted, like characters in a story who are moved from one chapter to another without ever realizing they missed a page. And if that's true, then the foundation of our self-awareness, our sense of being anchored in time, may be illusory. Some philosophers have tried to respond to this paradox by denying the possibility of unnoticeable blackouts. They argue that any real gap in time must leave a mark, however subtle, and that a perfect blackout is physically or metaphysically impossible. But Shoemaker's point is not that such blackouts will happen. It is that they can be imagined without contradiction, and that this possibility alone is enough to unsettle our assumption. It is a thought experiment, not a prediction, a way of showing that the structures we take for granted, identity, continuity, presence, can be questioned at their roots. There is a poetic dimension to this paradox as well. It speaks to the fragility of the now, the quiet mystery of each moment's arrival. We live in a stream of time, always moving forward, always trusting that the flow is smooth, but Shoemaker invites us to imagine that the stream may ripple, may jump, may pause and resume without us knowing, that time may be less a river and more a sequence of carefully edited frames, stitched together to preserve the illusion of motion. It suggests that our sense of continuity is not given by time itself, but by the story we tell about it, a story we revise without knowing. And so, the paradox is not merely a technical challenge, it is a philosophical mirror. It reflects our need for certainty, our hunger for presence, our assumption that experience must be complete to be real. It reminds us that absence can be hidden within presence, that gaps can be glossed over with perfect skill. And it does so not through science fiction or fantasy, but through the ordinary tools of logic and thought. In the end, Shoemaker's paradox is not about whether time skips will ever occur. It is about how easily our most basic beliefs can be made to tremble under the weight of a quiet question. It shows us that the self is more fragile than we think, that memory is not infallible, that time, so steady in our hands, might be stitched together behind the scenes, and it leaves us not with despair, but with a deeper kind of humility, a recognition that knowledge, especially self-knowledge, is always incomplete. So as you sit in this moment, hearing these words, ask yourself gently, how do I know this is today? How do I know I am the same person I was yesterday? The answer may be simple, but beneath the simplicity lies a riddle, a shoemaker's thread, sewing past to present, in stitches too fine to see, the Normativity Paradox. At the heart of all rules, all reasons, and all values lies a quiet assumption that we ought to follow them, that when something is right, we should do it, that when a belief is justified, we should hold it, that when a reason appears before us, it calls for a response. This gentle pull, this sense of oughtness, is what philosophers call normativity. It is the invisible force behind ethics, logic, rationality, and meaning itself. But like all things taken for granted, normativity hides a riddle. The moment we ask why we should follow the rules, why reasons matter, or why ought holds any weight at all, we find ourselves drifting into uncertainty. This is the Normativity Paradox, a quiet, unsettling contradiction that emerges when we try to justify the very force that gives justification its meaning. The paradox begins with a simple observation. We live in a world of norms. We say things like, you should keep your promises, you ought to believe the evidence, or you must treat others with respect. These are not just facts about what people do. They are claims about what people ought to do. They carry a kind of authority, a demand that isn't grounded in brute causality, but in something else, something higher, more abstract, yet deeply binding. The force behind these statements is not physical. It doesn't push or pull in space. And yet, when we hear a reason, when we see what is right, we feel it. We feel compelled to act, to believe, to revise. This invisible authority is what gives our lives structure, coherence, and meaning. But here is where the paradox starts to take shape. Suppose we ask a basic question. Why should we follow a norm? Why should we care about what we ought to do? If someone says, you should keep your promises, we might ask, why? They might respond, because it builds trust. Then we ask, and why is that good? They answer, because trust is essential for cooperation and human flourishing. Still, we press on. Why should I care about human flourishing? And here, at some point, we reach a wall. Either we find an answer that seems self-evident, or we run out of answers. And when we run out of answers, something curious happens. The very force of the norm begins to fade. The ought starts to dissolve. Not because it is false, but because we cannot justify its force without already presupposing it. This is the heart of the normativity paradox. Any attempt to justify normativity must already appeal to normativity. If you try to explain why we ought to follow moral rules, you must already assume that reasons matter. If you try to explain why logic compels belief, you are already using logic to do it. There is no neutral ground, no outside vantage point from which to evaluate norms without using norms. Every explanation is soaked in the very thing it tries to explain, and this leads to a strange situation. Either normativity justifies itself, or it cannot be justified at all. Some philosophers respond by saying that normativity is primitive, that it doesn't need a foundation because it is the foundation. Just as we don't ask why the laws of physics hold, perhaps we shouldn't ask why ought matters. It simply does. It is built into the structure of rational agents. But this response, while elegant, leaves many unsettled. It feels like an escape from the question rather than an answer. It tells us to stop asking, to accept normativity as a given, but the mind resists that closure. It keeps circling back. It wants to understand why the ought has authority, why it binds us, even when we don't want to follow it. The paradox grows more troubling when we imagine someone who rejects normativity entirely. Imagine a person who understands all the reasons, all the logic, all the moral claims, and simply doesn't care. They see what's right, but they don't feel compelled. They know what's rational, but they choose otherwise. We might call this person irrational or immoral, but our labels don't move them. They are aware, but unmoved. And suddenly we realize that normativity only works when we already accept its force. It cannot drag us into obedience. It can only speak and hope we listen. This creates a strange tension in our understanding of ethics and rationality. We often think of them as objective, binding, and universal. But the normativity paradox suggests that their power depends on our willingness to be bound, that the ought is only real for those who already hear its call. And yet, if we say that normativity is subjective or optional, we lose what makes it special. We reduce it to preference, to taste, to social convention, and that robs it of the authority we intuitively believe it has. So we are caught between two poles. If normativity is objective, it cannot be justified. If it must be justified, then it becomes conditional and loses its grip. This paradox reaches even deeper when we apply it to logic itself. Consider the rule of non-contradiction, that one cannot both affirm and deny the same proposition at the same time. This seems like a bedrock of rational thought, but why should we accept it? If someone says, "I reject logic," how do we argue with them without using logic? We cannot. Any attempt to defend logic must already use logic. This is the normativity of reasoning, its inescapability. And yet, that very inescapability is what makes it vulnerable to paradox. We cannot step outside logic to justify logic, just as we cannot step outside normativity to explain why it binds. Some philosophers have proposed that normativity is not a matter of justification, but of practice. That we show our commitment to norms not by explaining them, but by living them. We follow reasons because that is what it means to be a reason-giving creature. This is the view of thinkers like Wittgenstein, who saw language, meaning, and rules as rooted in shared forms of life. But even here, the paradox lingers. If normativity is just a practice, then what happens when someone steps outside the practice? Are they wrong or just different? And if they are just different, then again, normativity loses its force. The normativity paradox doesn't mean that ethics, logic, or rationality are illusions. It means that their authority is both necessary and inexplicable. That we live in a world where reasons matter, but we cannot say why they matter without already believing that they do. It is a paradox not of contradiction, but of circularity, a loop that cannot be broken, only acknowledged. And in that loop, we find both the strength and the fragility of our most fundamental commitments. There is something humbling about this. It reminds us that reason itself stands on ground it cannot fully explain, that the voice in our heads saying you should or you must is not backed by force, but by trust. Trust in the coherence of thought, trust in the meaningfulness of action, trust in the idea that reasons are not just descriptions, but calls. That when we understand what is right or true or good, we are not just learning, we are being asked to respond. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the paradox is not a flaw to be fixed, but a mirror. It shows us that normativity is not a thing we build, but a relation we live. That its power comes not from its ability to justify itself, but from its ability to guide us, even in the absence of final foundations. We follow norms not because we can prove we should, but because they help us navigate the world, to live, to think, to love, to learn. They help us form communities, resolve disagreements, and make sense of the flood of experience. In this way, the normativity paradox becomes less of a riddle and more of a meditation. It asks us to accept that some things matter without needing to ask why they matter. To see that the force of ought is not a chain, but a compass, not a command, but a gentle invitation. An invitation to be more coherent, more thoughtful, more responsive to the world and to others. And though we may never find a foundation that fully explains this force, we can still choose to live by it. So when you hear the quiet whisper of a reason, when you feel the pull to believe what is true, to do what is right, to think clearly and love justly, know that you are standing in the presence of normativity, a force that cannot prove itself, yet moves through everything, a paradox, yes, but also a gift, a thread woven into the heart of what it means to be human. Grelling's Autological Paradox. Language has a strange and subtle power. We use it to describe the world, to reflect on our thoughts, to build categories and identities. Sometimes we even use language to talk about itself. Words describing words, sentences referring to sentences. And it is here, within this quiet recursive loop, that the familiar begins to tremble. It is here that we encounter Grelling's Autological Paradox, a curious twist in the nature of self-prescription, a paradox that doesn't shout with contradiction, but hums softly beneath the surface of meaning, gently pulling at the strings that hold our linguistic world together. The paradox begins with two simple definitions. A word is autological if it describes itself. For example, the word short is autological if it is in fact a short word. The word English is autological because it is an English word. Polysyllabic is autological because it has more than one syllable. In contrast, a word is heterological if it does not describe itself. The word long is heterological if it is a short word. French is heterological if it is written in English. The distinction feels playful, almost like a linguistic game. It invites us to look at language from the side, to turn it inward, to examine how words fit or fail to fit the properties they name. But now comes the twist, the quiet, devastating question: is the word heterological itself heterological? Think about that carefully. If heterological is heterological, then it does not describe itself. But the word heterological means not describing itself. So if it does not describe itself, then it does describe itself. And if it does describe itself, then it is not heterological. But if it is autological, then it does describe itself. And since it means not describing itself, then again it does not describe itself. Back and forth we go. No answer will settle. We are caught in a self-referential loop, a contradiction that can't be resolved within the rules we've set. This is Grelling's paradox, discovered by the German philosopher Kurt Grelling in the early 20th century. It is a paradox not of sets or numbers, but of language, a semantic version of Russell's paradox, which concerns sets that do not contain themselves. In Grelling's version, the focus shifts to properties, specifically linguistic properties, and how they relate to the words that name them. And like Russell's paradox, it shows us something deeply unsettling, that certain systems of classification become unstable when they try to include themselves. What makes Grelling's paradox so striking is its clarity. Unlike the liar paradox, which turns on the ambiguity of "this sentence is false," Grelling's version feels more precise. It doesn't ask us to judge the truth of a sentence, but to decide whether a word fits a definition that it applies to itself. There's no deception, no trick, just a calm, careful reflection on how language behaves when it turns inward. And yet, that reflection leads to a contradiction, a quiet implosion of logic that happens not because of any error, but because of how meaning folds into itself. The paradox reveals a profound limitation in self-conception. Language can describe almost anything: objects, ideas, processes, feelings. But when it tries to describe itself without restraint, it creates loops that cannot be unwound. Grelling's paradox is a reminder that meaning is not infinite, that even the most powerful descriptive tools have boundaries, that when language reflects on language too directly, it can lose its footing and fall into contradiction. One might try to escape the paradox by denying that heterological is a well-formed property. Perhaps the very question is meaningless, but that feels unsatisfying. The definitions seem coherent, the question makes sense. What's broken is not the language itself, but the structure it creates when turned back on itself. This is the same insight that underlies Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Tarski's undefinability of truth. These results show that any system rich enough to describe certain aspects of itself will contain unresolvable paradoxes. Grelling's paradox is a linguistic version of this same phenomenon, a semantic knot that no theory can untangle without stepping outside its own rules. Some have proposed avoiding the paradox by formalizing language, building logical systems with strict rules that prevent self-direction. In such systems, terms like heterological would be disallowed or carefully restricted, but this feels like building a house with no mirrors. We avoid the danger by removing the possibility of reflection. It's safe, but it's also limiting, because self-direction is not just a source of paradox, it's also a source of power, creativity, and insight. When we reflect on ourselves, we grow. When language reflects on language, poetry is born. The paradox lies in the fact that the very act that creates meaning can also undo it. There's a philosophical lesson here about the nature of classification. We often assume that we can sort things cleanly into categories, that every object, word, or idea either fits a definition or it doesn't. But Grelling's paradox shows that some categories fail to classify themselves, that the act of classification can sometimes disrupt the system it's meant to organize. It's a reminder that reality is not always neat, that meaning, especially self-referential meaning, can overflow the containers we build for it. There is also a quiet beauty in this. The paradox doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't destroy meaning, it exposes its complexity. It invites us to slow down, to listen carefully to the structure of our thoughts, to see that even the simplest distinctions, like describes itself versus does not describe itself, can carry within them the seeds of infinite complexity. It teaches us that clarity is not always clean, and that some truths emerge not from resolution, but from dwelling in the space where resolution is impossible. In daily life, we don't think much about whether words are autological or heterological. We use language to communicate, to share experience, to get things done. But paradoxes like Grelling's remind us that beneath every conversation lies a philosophical minefield, that even the most ordinary words carry with them layers of logic and meaning that, when reflected upon, can reveal cracks in the very idea of expression. This is not a flaw in language, it is a feature. It shows that language is not a static tool, but a living system, one that contains within it the potential for both insight and contradiction. There is a meditative quality to this paradox. It asks us to sit with ambiguity, to recognize that some questions cannot be answered without unmaking the ground they stand on. It asks us to let go of the need for every concept to be neatly resolved, to see that understanding sometimes means embracing the loop rather than escaping it, that the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a pattern to observe. In this way, Grelling's paradox becomes more than a linguistic puzzle. It becomes a mirror for the mind. It reflects the way we try to understand ourselves, the way we search for clarity, and the way we sometimes stumble when that search turns inward. It reminds us that self-awareness is a delicate act, that reflecting on reflection can lead to insight, or to confusion, or to both at once. And in that duality, we find the human. So the next time you say a word, or think about what it means, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, does the word describe itself? Is it autological or heterological? And if that word is heterological, prepare to feel the ground shift beneath your feet. Not because you've made a mistake, but because you've touched a place where language curbs back on itself, a place where meaning becomes a spiral, a place where the search for definition reveals the limits of definition itself. This is the gentle gift of Grelling's paradox. It doesn't scold, it doesn't demand, it simply invites us to look closer, to think deeper, to feel the boundaries of thought, and in doing so, it leaves us with something rare, a sense of mystery not in the vastness of the universe, but in the folds of our own understanding. Paradox of Denotation. Language is filled with hidden doorways. It allows us to name the things we see, describe the thoughts we hold, and bridge the space between one mind and another. In the gentle act of referring, of pointing with words towards something else, we begin to build the world anew. And yet, behind this seemingly ordinary process of naming and referring, there lies a quiet enigma, an unsettling puzzle that slowly unfolds when language turns inward and attempts to refer to itself. This is the paradox of denotation, a subtle yet powerful philosophical puzzle that calls into question the very nature of reference, what it means for a name, a word, or a description to point to a thing in the world. The paradox begins with the idea of denotation, the act by which a term or expression refers to something. If I say the moon, you know I'm denoting the large, luminous object orbiting Earth. If I say the capital of France, you understand I'm referring to Paris. Denotation seems straightforward, even mechanical. A name denotes an object, a description denotes a concept. But when philosophers began examining the boundaries of this process, how names and terms can refer to themselves or to nothing at all, they found cracks forming beneath the surface. For what, truly, does a name refer to? And what happens when a name tries to refer to something that cannot be clearly named? The paradox is best approached through the concept of self-denoting expressions. These are phrases that refer to themselves, like the phrase in quotation marks on this page. Consider the expression, the first noun in this sentence. That phrase is an attempt to describe and denote itself. Or take the classic example, the denotation of, the denotation of, the denotation of. With each level, the phrase tries to refer not just to something in the world, but to its own act of referring. And here the machinery of language begins to grind. For if we can create terms that refer to themselves or to nothing, then the stability of reference becomes questionable. If language can aim its arrow and hit no target, what does it mean to speak meaningfully at all? This tension came into focus through the work of philosophers like Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. who tried to build formal systems for understanding language and logic. Their goal was clarity, to ensure that every expression in a language had a well-defined referent. But the moment self-referencing was introduced, contradictions appeared. Consider the phrase, "the present king of France." At a time when France has no king, what does this phrase denote? Does it refer to nothing? Is it meaningless? Or does it refer to a phantom, a placeholder of logic? Russell proposed that such phrases fail to denote anything at all. But if so, how can they still be used meaningfully in sentences? The paradox of denotation emerges when we consider expressions that appear to refer but do so in ways that undermine their own coherence. Imagine the phrase, "the expression that does not denote itself." Does this phrase refer to itself? If it does, then it must not denote itself by definition. But if it does not denote itself, then it fits the description and must denote itself. Like Grelling's paradox, this is a self-referential loop that collapses under its own weight. We are left with a sentence that cannot decide whether it refers or not. The very act of trying to denote becomes the source of paradox. This strange loop mirrors other famous paradoxes, like the liar paradox, in which a sentence states of itself that it is false. But the paradox of denotation isn't about truth, it's about reference. It's about the ability of language to hook onto something, to point clearly toward a thing, a concept, a reality. When reference becomes unstable, meaning itself becomes uncertain. And this is where the paradox becomes not just a logical puzzle, but a philosophical warning. It shows us that the power of language to refer is not unlimited. That reference, like understanding, depends on conditions we do not always control. Consider how this paradox echoes in everyday speech. We often use descriptions that seem precise but refer to nothing. Phrases like "the greatest possible number" or "the square circle." These combinations of words have grammatical form, but they fail to denote any real entity. Still, they feel meaningful. They can be part of arguments, of poetry, of dreams. So are they referring to ideas, to impossibilities, or do they point to nothing at all? The paradox of denotation invites us to ask whether reference requires existence. Can a term denote what is not? And if it can, what kind of meaning does it carry? This paradox touches the edge of metaphysics and epistemology, the study of what exists and what we can know. When we speak of unicorns or the limits of language, are we merely playing with sound, or are we brushing up against something real, even if unrealized? Denotation, it turns out, is not just a mechanical process. It is an act of interpretation, of projection, of placing our thoughts in contact with the world, or with the shape of what the world could be. And when language tries to refer to itself or to things that cannot exist, it reveals its own architecture. The system flexes and creaks, revealing the boundaries of reference itself. One proposed response to the paradox is to distinguish between use and mention, to be clear about when we are referring to a word as an object and when we are using it in speech. So, "snow is white" uses the words white. "Snow is white" has 3 words, mentions the sentence as a linguistic entity. But this technical fix doesn't dissolve the paradox, because at its heart, the issue is not confusion, but the nature of denotation itself. The paradox shows that certain constructions, even when carefully formed, fail to latch onto any stable object. They hover, grammatically intact, but semantically adrift. The implications ripple outward. In philosophy of mind, we might ask, can thoughts refer to thoughts? Can a mind reflect on itself without creating a contradiction? In computational theory, we ask, can a program describe its own behavior without infinite regress? In mathematics, we find limits on what can be named, defined, or counted. The paradox of denotation is not a linguistic curiosity. It is a mirror held up to the structure of knowledge, reminding us that not all expressions find a home. Some are destined to wander. And yet, paradoxically, these wandering expressions still shape our understanding. They help us define the borders of sense. They show us where language stops, where silence begins. In this way, the paradox of denotation performs a quiet function. It teaches us to be cautious with meaning, to see that clarity is not always found in complexity, that sometimes the more we try to explain what we mean, the more the meaning recedes, and that perhaps, like shadows, some truths can only be seen by the outlines they leave behind. There is also a deep poetic resonance to the paradox. Language, like thought, is not just a mirror of the world, it is a maker of worlds. And in its attempt to name everything, including itself, it sometimes stumbles. It names what cannot be named. It refers to what cannot be touched. But in doing so, it creates a space of possibility, a realm where meaning is fluid, where the act of denoting becomes a kind of dance. The paradox is not an error. It is a sign that language is alive, always reaching beyond itself. So what do we make of this quiet contradiction? Do we try to ban such expressions? Do we rewrite our systems to avoid self-wreckage, to deny terms the ability to turn back and look at themselves? Some formal systems do exactly that. They limit the kinds of expressions allowed. They avoid the paradox by reducing expressive power. But in doing so, they also reduce richness. Because the paradox, like so many in philosophy, is not just a problem, it is a threshold, a place where language, logic, and understanding converge. A reminder that denotation is not just a tool, it is a mystery. And perhaps that is the lesson to carry forward, that even in the clearest moments of speech, there is a shadow, that meaning is never entirely secure, that some expressions refuse to point and yet still reveal, that the paradox of denotation is not something to resolve once and for all, but something to return to sit with, to allow it to teach us about the edges of language and the humility of knowing. We cannot name everything, we cannot refer to everything, and sometimes, in trying, we uncover the silent spaces where truth hides behind form. So, the next time you hear a phrase that seems to refer to nothing, or to itself, or to something that can never be, the next time you speak a sentence that folds inward like a mirror of thought, pause. Let the paradox breathe. Let it remind you that language is both bridge and boundary, that denotation is both a connection and a question, that meaning is not just what we point to, but what points back. The meta-liar paradox. In the beginning, there was a sentence, simple, clean, and quietly subversive. This sentence is false. It is neither a grand philosophical statement nor a scientific claim. It is just 7 words. But in those 7 words lies a loop, a quiet contradiction that logic cannot escape. This is the liar paradox, one of the oldest and most enduring riddles in philosophy. A sentence that undoes itself simply by speaking. If the sentence is true, then what it says must hold, it must be false. But if it is false, then it is not the case that it is false, and so it must be true. Round and round it goes, never settling. A sentence about itself, spinning in a loop of unresolvable tension. And from this loop, a deeper version emerges, a paradox that doesn't just lie, but talks about the lie itself. This is the meta-liar paradox, where the contradiction doesn't just occur in a sentence, but in the structure of truth. The meta-liar paradox is a step deeper into self-recognition. It is not just about a single sentence claiming to be false, but about the collection of all liar sentences and the systems that try to evaluate them. It is what happens when we look not at one liar, but at the mechanism that judges the liar, and find that the contradiction doesn't stay in the sentence. It seeps into the meta-language, into the levels of truth, into the very act of assessing truth itself. Where the classic liar paradox whispers, "I am false," the meta-liar paradox says, "The set of all liar sentences is inconsistent," and asks, Is that claim itself consistent? To understand this, we must step into a world where language is layered. Imagine a base level where we talk about apples and skies and people. Above it, a second level where we talk about statements about apples and skies and people. And above that, another layer still, where we talk about the truth or falsity of those statements. This layered structure is what we call a meta-language, language about language, and it's useful. It allows us to make distinctions between an idea and a comment on the idea, but when these layers start to refer to themselves, the structure begins to crack. Suppose we have a sentence. Sentence S is not true. This is a version of the classic liar. Now suppose we define a sentence M. Sentence S is not true. In this case, M is not directly self-referential, it is talking about S. But now we ask, is M true? To assess M, we must assess whether S is not true. But S is not true. And so, by referencing S, we're pulled back into the same loop. What seemed like a move to higher ground was not a true escape, it was a return by another path. The meta-liar shows us that even if we try to analyze the liar sentence from above, the contradiction follows us. Truth itself becomes slippery, escaping our attempts to pin it down. Alfred Tarski, a towering figure in 20th century logic, tried to resolve the free river liar paradox by separating languages from their mead languages. He argued that a language should not be able to contain its own truth predicate. That is, a language should not be able to say of its own sentences, this is true or this is false. By doing this, we avoid the self-redirection that creates the paradox. But the meta-liar paradox challenges even this solution. Because once we define truth in a higher level language, and then try to speak about that truth, we find the same loops re-emerging. We find ourselves asking whether the truth system itself is coherent, and that question circles back. If we claim the truth system is inconsistent, is that statement true or false? We are caught once again. The meta-liar paradox reveals that self-recognition is more pervasive than we thought. It cannot simply be escaped by climbing up one level, because at every level, we retain the ability to reflect back. Language doesn't just move upward, it loops, it spirals, it turns inward. This is not a flaw of language, but a feature of consciousness. Our minds do not just perceive, they perceive their own perceptions. We do not merely think, we think about thought. And in that recursive act, we enter the domain of the meta-liar, a realm where each answer becomes another question, and each question opens another contradiction. Consider a system designed to analyze truth, a computer program perhaps, that processes statements and flags contradictions. Now suppose that program receives as input a sentence that says, "This program cannot determine whether this sentence is true." The program must now evaluate a claim about its own inability. If it agrees with the sentence, then it concedes it cannot decide, and yet it has decided. If it disagrees, then it claims it can determine the truth, but in doing so, it violates the content of the sentence. Either way, the system is compromised. This is a real-world version of the meta-liar, showing that logical systems designed to evaluate truth can themselves become entangled when they are part of the evaluation. The paradox reaches further still into the foundations of mathematics and logic. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which shattered the dream of a complete and consistent formal system, rely on this kind of self-gnosis. Gödel showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system can encode statements about itself, and that within such a system, one can construct a statement that says, this statement is not provable. If the system proves the statement, it contradicts itself. If it cannot prove it, the statement is true, but unprovable. Here we see the meta-liar again, not just a sentence that breaks logic, but a logic that exposes its own incompleteness. The meta-liar also has implications for epistemology, the study of knowledge. Suppose someone says, all statements made by this person are untrustworthy. And then that person says, that previous statement is untrustworthy. How do we resolve this? Trust and truth become tangled. Authority collapses into contradiction. The paradox reveals that meta-beliefs, beliefs about beliefs, are vulnerable to the same instability, and because so much of our thinking involves layers of evaluation, self-assessment, and reflection, this instability touches almost everything. Some have proposed solutions through paraconsistent logic, a form of logic that tolerates contradiction without collapsing. In paraconsistent systems, a statement can be both true and false without making everything meaningless. This allows for a kind of containment where paradoxes like the meta-liar are acknowledged but do not infect the entire system. Others suggest three-valued logic, where a sentence can be true, false, or indeterminate. Still others build hierarchical systems where each level of language has its own truth criteria, insulated from the loops below. But none of these solutions fully dissolves the paradox. They merely shift the weight, redistribute the contradiction, or accept it as a permanent feature of reflective thought. In this way, the meta-liar paradox becomes not just a problem, but a lens, a way of seeing the limits of our tools. It teaches us that truth is not a static object, that our attempts to map it, formalize it, contain it are always partial, that in the realm of reflection there is no final ground, and perhaps this is not a flaw to be fixed, but a truth to be embraced. Perhaps the paradox is not the enemy of meaning, but its shadow, always present when we try to step beyond what we can say. There is something quietly beautiful about this. The meta-liar is not a loud contradiction. It does not scream. It waits. It watches from the edges, showing us that clarity has a cost, that certainty has limits, that systems can never fully explain themselves. And in this, it resembles the deepest truths of human existence. We are creatures who ask why, but must sometimes live without answers, who speak, but must accept that some meanings cannot be contained in speech. So let the paradox rest. Do not rush to solve it. Let it be what it is, a reminder that thought, like language, curls back on itself, that truth, like reflection, is never quite complete, and that, in the quiet places where logic falters, we find not confusion, but depth. Not failure, but the edge of understanding. Semantic paradox of the knower. There is a quiet mystery in knowing. We think of knowledge as a light, illuminating what is true and cutting through the fog of doubt. To know something is to be anchored in reality, to grasp not just belief, but justified, stable truth. Yet beneath the surface of this clarity, there lies a soft, looping shadow, a riddle that turns knowing back upon itself and reveals that the very act of claiming knowledge can sometimes collapse under its own weight. This is the semantic paradox of the knower, a subtle yet profound puzzle that emerges when knowledge attempts to evaluate its own presence. It is a paradox not of deception, but of self-deception. Not a failure of facts, but a strange twist in the structure of knowing itself. The paradox begins with a sentence that seems harmless at first glance. Consider this statement. This sentence is not known by anyone. We are not told that it is false or meaningless or impossible, only that it is not known. The question then arises, is the sentence true or false? And here begins the slow spiral inward. If the sentence is true, then what it says is the case, namely, that it is not known by anyone. But if it is not known by anyone, then how can we now know it? The moment we recognize its truth, we contradict it. The sentence claims to be unknown, but its truth requires it to remain that way. If anyone knows it, it becomes false. But if no one knows it, how can we affirm it is true? This is the paradox of the knower, first clearly articulated in the 20th century by logicians examining the foundations of epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge. At its core, it is a semantic paradox, meaning that it arises from the structure of meaning and truth, rather than physical contradiction. Like the liar paradox, which states, "This sentence is false." The knower paradox involves a kind of self-centric, but here, instead of truth or falsity, it concerns knowability, a softer, more elusive notion that seems at first immune to paradox. And yet, the problem cuts just as deep. To see the force of the paradox, let's assume that all knowledge is factive. That is, if someone knows something, it must be true. This is a basic principle of epistemology. You cannot know something that isn't the case. So, if someone knows the sentence, "This sentence is not known," then the sentence must be true, but its truth asserts that it is not known, so it cannot be known. But if no one knows it, and yet it is true, then we must accept that there is a truth that no one can know, and that admission that some truths are forever outside the reach of knowledge pulls at the foundations of what it means to know. There is a deeper question lurking beneath this surface contradiction. Can the concept of knowledge be applied to itself? That is, can we know things about knowledge in the same way we know things about trees or planets or emotions? The knower paradox suggests that perhaps not, that there may be limits on how far knowledge can reach when it tries to turn inward. Just as no camera can capture its own lens without a mirror, perhaps knowledge cannot fully account for its own boundaries without distortion. Some philosophers have tried to escape the paradox by distinguishing between different levels of knowledge. In this view, the sentence, "This sentence is not known," operates on a different level than our knowledge of its truth. Perhaps we can say that the sentence is not known at the object level, but is known at the meta level. But this solution feels like rearranging the paradox rather than dissolving it, because the moment we claim to know something about knowledge, we invite the same problem back in. The sentence reasserts itself, demanding a clear answer: is it known or not? Others propose that the paradox arises because we are treating knowledge too much like truth. In logic, truth is a binary. Either something is true or it isn't. But knowledge might be more nuanced. It might depend on context, justification, or even temporal factors. Maybe the sentence, "This sentence is not known," was once true, but now that we have discussed it, it becomes false. Perhaps knowledge is dynamic, and the paradox merely reflects a mismatch between a static sentence and a living, shifting epistemic state. But this answer too leaves something unresolved, because even if knowledge evolves, the structure of the paradox does not. The contradiction is not about the history of belief. It is about the status of the sentence at the moment it is considered. This brings us to a more unsettling possibility, that not all truths are knowable, that the universe may contain facts that no mind, not human, not divine, not artificial, can ever grasp. This idea, though difficult, has support in formal logic. In 1931, Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that in any sufficiently powerful system, there will be truths that cannot be proven within the system. The knower paradox is a cousin to this result. It tells us that there may be truths about knowledge that cannot be known without breaking the very definition of knowledge itself. There is also a psychological version of the paradox. Imagine a person who comes to believe, quite sincerely, that "I do not know this belief." The more they reflect on it, the more tangled their thinking becomes. If they believe the belief is unknown, then they know it. If they know it, then their belief is false. This creates a kind of epistemic vertigo, where the mind chases itself in circles, unable to land. It is a reminder that the human mind, in its capacity for reflection, can create puzzles it cannot untangle. That thinking about thinking, while powerful, has limits. In the realm of artificial intelligence, this paradox takes on new weight. If we design machines to evaluate knowledge, to assess what they know and what they do not, how do they handle a sentence like, "This sentence is not known by any system"? Can an algorithm process that claim without creating a loop? Can it model its own knowledge without contradiction? These are not just technical questions, they are philosophical ones. They touch on the boundaries of self-awareness, recursion, and the architecture of intelligent thought. Some contemporary approaches attempt to sidestep the paradox using non-classical logics, logical systems that reject some of the traditional laws of thought. For instance, paraconsistent logic allows for contradictions without collapse, or intuitionistic logic, which treats truth as something that must be constructively demonstrated. In these systems, the knower paradox does not explode into contradiction. It becomes a marker of uncertainty, of ambiguity, of indeterminacy. But adopting these frameworks comes with a cost. We lose some of the crispness, the clarity that classical logic offers. And we must accept a new terrain of reasoning, where paradoxes are not resolved, but absorbed. What remains then is a paradox that cannot be solved cleanly, but must be understood slowly. It teaches us something not just about knowledge, but about humility. That even our most powerful tool, our ability to know, has edges it cannot see. That reflection is both a gift and a mirror, revealing not just what is true, but what may never be fully known. The knower paradox is not a flaw in reason, it is a whisper from its boundaries. It invites us to consider that knowing is not absolute, that it may always come with a shadow, a silence, a space where certainty dissolves. And perhaps this is not something to fear, but something to accept. To know that we do not know everything and may not be able to is to step into a deeper kind of wisdom, a wisdom that holds space for doubt, that walks gently at the edge of paradox. So, let the sentence echo once more. This sentence is not known. Let it spin quietly in the mind. Let it unsettle, not with noise, but with stillness. Let it remind you that knowledge is not a fortress, but a horizon, always receding, always inviting, never fully grasped. And in that endless reaching, there is something deeply human, a paradox not to solve, but to live alongside. Paradox of free choice, permission. Language is not just a way of expressing thoughts, it is a way of shaping them. Through it, we make distinctions, grant rights, draw boundaries, and form agreements. When we say, "You may take an apple," we are not merely stating a fact. We are giving permission, creating a possibility, and when that permission includes choice, it seems to expand rather than restrict. But in the logic of language, as with many things, simplicity often hides surprise. And nestled within the folds of such ordinary expressions is a riddle that twists the meaning of permission into paradox. This is the paradox of free choice. Permission, a quiet but powerful puzzle about how the words may and or dance together in unexpected ways. Consider this simple sentence. You may have coffee or tea. On the surface, this sounds generous. You are being given a choice. You are free to have coffee, free to have tea, and presumably not obligated to have both or either. The structure seems clear. One or the other. Your preference honored. But now let us analyze the logic behind the phrase. If you may have coffee or tea is true, does it follow that you may have coffee? Intuitively, yes. If I'm allowed to choose between two things, then I must be allowed to choose either one. Likewise, it seems to follow that you may have tea, but this is where the paradox begins to whisper. In formal logic, the expression A or B typically means that at least one of A or B is permitted or true, possibly both. But when we use free choice permission, the use of or seems to split into two separate permissions. The sentence, you may have coffee or tea, entails that you may have coffee or tea entails that you may have tea. But logically speaking, this is unexpected. From a single permission involving a disjunction, we derive two separate permissions involving each disjunct. That is, the logic seems to move from permission of a whole to permission of each part, even though the original sentence does not explicitly say that both options are independently allowed. This is the paradox. How can a single permission involving a disjunction entail multiple permissions that were never individually granted? If I say, "You may read a novel or watch a movie," does that mean you have separate, independent permissions to do either? And if so, could this logic lead us into trouble? What happens if we apply this form to more complex or sensitive domains? Legal permissions, ethical choices, or contractual obligation? What seemed like a simple linguistic gesture becomes a puzzle of entailment and implication. To see the force of the paradox more clearly, let's contrast it with a similar expression, "You may have coffee." Here, the permission is specific. It allows for one action, clearly stated. If I add, "You may have tea," I've granted a second, separate permission. But when I say, "You may have coffee or tea," I seem to be saying less, giving a disjunctive option rather than two separate allowances. And yet, the way we interpret that statement includes both permissions. In this way, the sentence, "You may have coffee or tea," seems to be logically stronger than either disjunct, but also logically equivalent to the pair of permissions taken together. This violates the expectations of standard logic, where "or" typically narrows possibilities rather than expands them. One of the challenges of this paradox is that it lies at the intersection of modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility, and natural language semantics. In modal logic, the word "may" is a modal operator, expressing permission or possibility. But in natural language, "may" is soaked in context. It carries with it implications of choice, politeness, flexibility, and social convention. This gap between formal structure and pragmatic meaning is where the paradox thrives. We use "or" in ordinary speech to create a sense of choice, but logic interprets "or" as a potentially exclusive structure. The result is a mismatch between what we say and what our words seem to mean under logical scrutiny. Some philosophers have tried to resolve the paradox by suggesting that "may" behaves non-classically when it combines with "or." That is, when "may" takes a disjunction as its object, it distributes across the disjuncts, giving separate permissions to each. This would explain why "you may have coffee or tea" seems to imply "you may have coffee." It requires altering our understanding of how permission interacts with logic. In classical modal logic, permission does not automatically distribute over disjunction. Changing that rule creates a new logic entirely, one tailored to match the quirks of language, but perhaps at the cost of broader coherence. Others suggest that the paradox is not logical at all, but pragmatic, that the meaning of "you may have coffee or tea" depends not on the sentence structure, but on the expectations and context in which it is uttered. In this view, the sentence functions as a speech act, a way of offering choices rather than stating logical facts. The speaker intends for both options to be available, even if the structure of the sentence doesn't logically entail that. This pragmatic solution softens the paradox, suggesting that the contradiction is more about interpretation than syntax. But it also leaves the deeper logical question unresolved. Why does our understanding of permission stretch beyond what the sentence strictly says? This tension between syntax and semantics, between form and use, lies at the heart of the free choice permission paradox. It shows us that language is not merely a logical system, it is a social tool, shaped by expectations, conventions, and the rhythms of conversation. When we grant permission, we are not merely constructing possibilities, we are engaging in trust, negotiation, and shared understanding. The paradox reminds us that logic and language do not always walk hand in hand, and that when they part ways, we must choose which path to follow, the one of formal structure or the one of lived meaning. In deeper philosophical terms, the paradox touches on freedom and constraint. When we say "you may do A or B," we are offering a freedom, a range of action, but the paradox shows that in offering that freedom, we may inadvertently grant more than we intended. The logic of free choice extends the field of possibility beyond the original sentence. It builds new permissions from old ones. This is both generous and dangerous. Generous because it reflects our instinct to allow choice. Dangerous because it reveals that our permissions are not as precise as we might believe. In law and ethics, this can have real consequences. Consider a legal contract that says, the tenant may use the garden or the rooftop. If that sentence is interpreted as granting two separate permissions, it opens doors the author may not have intended. The logic of free choice becomes a tool for interpretation, a lens through which rights and limits are defined. The paradox is no longer abstract. It becomes a force that shapes real decisions, real lives, and real consequences. So what is the lesson of the free choice permission paradox? Perhaps it is this, that freedom, when expressed through language, always exceeds its form, that the act of offering choice is not merely a logical gesture, but a human one, and that within that gesture lies a complexity that cannot be fully captured by structure alone. We must listen not just to what is said, but to how it is said, to the tone, the context, the subtle cues that accompany permission, because in those details we find the true shape of meaning. And perhaps too, the paradox teaches us a gentler lesson, that logic, for all its elegance, cannot always contain the fullness of communication, that permission is not just about what is allowed, but about what is offered, what is shared, what is welcomed, what is opened. The paradox reminds us that language is alive, that it bends, stretches, and sometimes contradicts itself in order to carry our intentions forward, and that in those contradictions we glimpse something honest, not about error, but about the richness of meaning. So the next time you hear someone say, "You may do this or that," let the words rest softly in your mind. Listen for the logic, yes, but also for the invitation. Feel the quiet opening of possibility, the subtle expansion of what may be. And remember that behind every permission lies a paradox not of conflict, but of complexity, a paradox that does not ask to be solved, but simply seen.